114, 127.
Hang on, Burley County, 112, 114, you said?
Correct.
14 was offered and admitted.
Okay. 112.
112 has not.
Okay. And 127.
127 was not.
And 133.
That one was not either. I don't know who wants to respond, but any objection on behalf of the applicant?
No, it was 112.
127 and 133.
No objection, Your Honor.
And Mr. Pell?
No objections.
All right, 112, 127, and 133 are received.
Okay, thank you, Your Honor. We'll call Mr. Dan McLean.
Good afternoon, Mr. McLean. I'll have you start by stating your full name for the record. Is your microphone on? It should be a blue.
Blue, okay.
There, that sounds better. Okay, start again.
Dan McLean,
And can you spell your last name for me?
MC capital L-E-A-N.
And Mr. McLean, were you in the room earlier when I went through the penalties for perjury?
No, I wasn't.
All right, well, I'm required by law to advise you on the penalties for perjury. Perjury is a Class C felony, punishable by a maximum fine of $10,000, a maximum 5 years imprisonment, or both. Do you understand what perjury is?
Yes, I do.
And being advised of the potential penalties for perjury, do you promise to tell the truth in this case today?
Yes, I do.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Bakke.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. McLean, be fair to say public speaking isn't one of your favorite things?
Yes, it is. It's not, no, it's
Well,
not good.
We'll get through this. And you attended one or more of the hearings before.
Yes, I have. Yeah.
And how is it that at those other ones you didn't decide to come forward and testify during any opportunities for the public to comment?
I do a whole lot better in the back of the room than I do at the front.
Okay. So you were a little shy to be a person to step forward. Is that correct?
What's that?
You were a little shy to step forward.
Yeah, I
previously.
guess you'd call it that.
Okay. And where do you reside?
I'm Minokan on the farm.
Okay. And are you married?
Yes, I am.
Okay. And is your wife Sue with you here today?
Yes, she is.
Seated in the back row in the red jacket?
Yep.
Okay. And you said you live near Minokan. Which township is that?
Boyd.
Okay. And if you look in the binder in front of you at exhibit Burley County 130, you can just turn to the tab on the side that says 130.
Okay. That's a map.
Yeah. Is that a map showing Boyd Township?
Yeah, Boyd. No, let's see. I think I'm page too far here. Yeah, that's Boyd Township, it says on there. Yep.
Okay. And then the second page of that, is that a map showing Boyd Township in there as well, and also identifies the other townships that border Boyd Township?
Yeah.
Okay. Your Honor, we'll offer Burley County Exhibit 130.
Any objection to 130?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. Pella?
No objection.
130 is received.
Okay. So if we turn to the second page of 130 and look in Boyd Township, there are section numbers identified there, and where is the land that your wife and you own in Boyd Township?
Section 5, southwest, south half of section 5.
Okay, and any other land that you own?
We own 3/4 south of that.
And which section would that be in?
17 and 18, I believe. Let's see, let me look again here. Yeah, 17 and 18. No, 16 and 17, I should say. I should know that, but
And how many acres do you own in section 16 and 17?
we own 3/4.
Okay. And then you own the south half, so 2/4 in section 5.
Yes,
Okay. And where do you live?
we live on 16.
And then how long have you resided there?
My entire life.
And if we look at in reference to section 5, is that an area where Summit has indicated to you that they would like to construct a CO2 pipeline in that location?
Yes, it is.
And how big of an area are they proposing to cross?
It's from the southwest corner, going angled to the northeast, and it's just a little over a quarter or half mile.
Okay. So would that essentially cut right through the middle of your field?
Yes, it would.
And is there someone currently farming that land?
Yes, my neighbor is.
Okay. Did you and your wife Sue for many years farm that land?
Yeah, we've had it for 30 years.
Okay. And then at some point as you got older, did you decide to lease it out?
Yeah, the drought came along and we sold our cattle and didn't need the hay anymore, so we rented it out.
Okay. And are there crops that are planted or will be planted this year in section 5?
Yeah, there's wheat planted on it right now.
And in previous years, what has been planted in the field that Summit wants to construct the pipeline on in section 5?
Well, last year it was corn. He grew corn for his cattle. And before that it was hay, and we grew other crops on it too over the years. Alfalfa mostly.
And how long have you and your wife been retired?
Well, we retired from our town jobs. I think she's 8 years and I think I'm 6. She's either 8 or 9, and I'm either 6 or 7.
And you mentioned your town job. What was your town job?
Well, last job was Burley County Highway Department. And before that, I was a construction worker and a service worker.
Okay. Have you worked with pipelines in the past?
I've been around pipelines in the past, yes.
Okay. And in what type of job were you working in?
Well, mostly, I laid pipe down just ahead of where they were laying on the ground when they did the Northern Border Pipeline, which is back in the 80s. I did that for a week. That's about the most I've been on pipelines.
Okay.
And I've been around them when they were working on them otherwise.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you work on some jobs at Dakota Gasification Company?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And what kind of work did you do there?
There we worked on conveyor belts and coal chutes and that type of stuff. But yeah, we worked around the piping around it, not with it.
Okay. And were there on occasion leaks in those pipes of the that you worked around?
There was one or two, but they weren't close to us or didn't affect us, but they didn't clear the plant because of it or anything.
And how far away is your residence in section 5 from, or how far away is your home? Is it section 16 you live in?
Yeah,
Okay, so how far is it from where your home is to the section where they want to put it, Summit wants to put the pipeline in the middle of the field, and that's section 5, correct?
yep. That would, from our house to the pipe would be about 2 miles or just barely over.
Do you have any utility lines, gas lines, power lines, or other pipelines or lines on your property?
Yeah, we got a water line that runs across it, both quarters, from east to west, and we have a transmission line that runs from east to west across it.
And did you provide easements for those utility lines?
The transmission line was there when we bought it, and the water line, yeah, we did. We signed for it.
Okay.
Run across it.
And has there ever before the Summit pipeline ever been a time where you've refused to provide a utility easement requested by a utility company or a water line?
No.
Have you or your wife Sue ever served on the Boyd Township board in the past?
Yeah, Sue's been on there 19 years and I've been on there 16.
And are you currently both on the board,
Yeah.
township board?
Yes, we are.
Okay, when were you first contacted by Summit in relation to them wanting to construct a pipeline on your property?
The fall of 22, I believe is when it was.
Okay, and how did they contact you?
By phone.
Okay. And did this individual introduce themselves?
He never gave me a name.
And how did he start the conversation?
He said he wanted to come out to my house and talk to me about putting the pipeline across my property.
Did he tell you whether or not that was their plan and that they were going to proceed with a pipeline, or did he inquire whether you were interested, or how did he approach it?
He said he was coming out to my house to talk to me about putting the pipeline that was going across my property.
Okay. And how did you react to that?
I told him I wasn't interested and that he didn't need to come.
Okay. And did he say anything else?
That's all I said.
Okay.
At that point.
Okay. Did he say anything about what would happen if you didn't agree to Summit putting a pipeline on your property?
Well, he said you might as well let me come out and talk to you because we're going to put a pipeline across your property and we'll take it by eminent domain if you don't want to, so you might as well get some money out of it.
Okay. So from the very first phone conversation, this representative from Summit threatened you with eminent domain if you wouldn't agree to the pipeline crossing your property?
Yeah, he said they'd take it by eminent domain if I didn't agree to it.
Okay. Did the conversation get a bit heated?
Yeah, I told him he couldn't do that. At that time, he couldn't do it. And that he wasn't going to put it across there. And yeah, it got quite heated.
Okay. Did the Summit representative swear at you?
I'm not sure who swore first, but yes, he did.
And did you feel like this individual from Summit was trying to intimidate you?
Oh yeah, he was trying.
Okay. And then what happened next with Summit after that initial call where they threatened eminent domain?
Well, at that point, I hung up on him and I didn't hear from him for a little while.
Okay. So was there a second call?
Yeah, it was the winter of 22, 23, somewhere in there. I don't remember exactly what time.
Okay.
Your Honor, I'm gonna just object because the purposes of this hearing relate to the reconsideration, and with all due respect to Mr. McLean here, he chose not to testify at prior hearings, and we seem to be covering areas that have been covered, not on a reroute location, not related to any of the items that were identified in the reconsideration order from the commission. So unless there are some specific questions that are appropriate for these proceedings, I don't know what additional information this witness can offer on behalf of Burleigh County for these proceedings.
Want to respond, Mr. Bakke?
Sure, Your Honor. I don't think there was any time frame involved that said before the PSC made a final decision on Summit's application that other people couldn't come forward and express concerns about the route across their property in Burleigh County. I think, my understanding, I could be wrong, but I think the PSC is still assessing whether affected landowners should be routed around for meritorious reasons, or if the route across someone's property could be put in a location that was less intrusive on their property and didn't devalue their property unnecessarily or affect their farming operations and other considerations. It's not my intention to take a long time with Mr. McLean, but I think, these threats of eminent domain, and he's going to talk about what happened with the survey, are also impeachment of some of the testimony we heard from Summit's witnesses yesterday, which contradict their testimony, and that's relevant as well, because it goes to the credibility of the Summit witnesses as to whether they're going to carry through with their promises that they're making to the PSC and to the public and to the parties.
Just to clarify, Mr. McLean is not on the reroute, like he was on the initial route, the part that has not changed.
He's on the initial route.
Well, here's my concerns. On your pre-filed witness list, Mr. Bakke, you indicated that if you called Mr. McLean, your examination would be 10 minutes, and we're now at least 15 minutes in. And so, again, I think the commission has heard from multiple landowners about Summit landmen, what they have represented, that it's different than what Summit employees or representatives have testified to in this hearing room. So don't believe this line of questioning is anything new. It doesn't add anything to the evidence that's already been received. With that said, we've had public testimony come from individuals that weren't just on the proposed reroute. So I'll allow you to do some very limited evidence or testimony from Mr. McLean, but we don't need to go into every phone call or every correspondence with Summit, because we've heard this type of testimony from other landowners.
Yeah, and I was just asking for the same consideration that was provided to the landowner interveners this morning with Mr. Malloy, who went through kind of the same process of the contacts that he had and his rationale. But if you're telling me I can't do that, I'll certainly follow whatever order the judge gives me in that regard. I guess I need to know, is the last objection sustained, or should he not answer the question, or should he?
Well, I guess my comment is my comments, I suppose it's partially sustained. I'll allow you to have Mr. McLean talk about his general concerns relative to his property, but I am sustaining it going down this road about talking about every correspondence with Summit, because we've heard this. And the commission has heard this already. They've heard the type of representations that have made regarding eminent domain. And I've said throughout many hearings, and it was in the August 4th order, that the commission has no jurisdiction over eminent domain. It is what it is. So we need to move on from the eminent domain.
Okay. Well, I could tell you what he would testify to as essentially an offer of proof, that in relation to the survey, that contrary to Mr. Powell's testimony yesterday, that they worked with landowners on surveys. They did not do that with Mr. McLean. He received, and we've marked it as BC 129. They threw an envelope in his backyard, not even at the front door, in the dirt on the ground. And fortunately, it was found by Mr. McLean's wife. And when he saw it, his intention, it arrived on a Saturday afternoon. His intention was on Monday morning to contact an attorney to resist that. And Summit showed up and was already surveying his property when they had thrown the envelope in the back on a Saturday afternoon. And approximately less than 48 hours later,
I don't know if you folks can hear me, but the video froze and there's no audio as of about 3 minutes ago. And I can't hear anything if anyone's speaking.
Hey Brian, I'm back up in our hearing room. They're trying to resolve issues down in the Pioneer room.
Very good. I can hear you. That's great. I'll just sit tight.
Okay.
I think we're good. Go ahead, Mr.
Okay.
Rocky.
And as part of the offer of proof, in relation to the second phone call from Summit in winter 2022, 2023, he would testify that although the caller from Summit did not identify himself, he recognized Dave Nearing as the caller and because he knew him and lived fairly close by, and that Mr. Nearing told him that he should enter into an easement with Summit and at least try to get some money. That I described it, even though it was a FedEx delivery envelope, it was not a FedEx delivery person who dropped it off. Is that accurate, Mr. McLean?
Yes, it was something in a white car and a black coat.
And there was a fourth contact by someone from Summit who wanted to come out to the property and wanted to get a easement from the McLeans. And Mr. McLean told him no, and he said, "I'll put you down as a
I don't have the video.
a hard no." Is that correct?
Yes, they can hear audio but not video.
And his testimony.
I've unplugged the video cable and plugged it back in.
Some of the testimony.
But I haven't touched it.
Yesterday by Mr. Powell and Mr. Boyce, and the final topic, and we'll mark this as Burley County Exhibit 135, you can pass that around. Just received that from Mr. McLean today. And this goes to the indemnity issue, not in relation to, not on insurance, but kind of the same point as Mr. McCoy, in the respect that he has received verification from his insurance agent that his pipeline runs on his property.
On the dock.
Not only would there be insurance coverage, but it would be strict liability. There would be, whether he's negligent or not, there would be no insurance coverage for pollution from the CO2 pipeline, and that's a different aspect, and I think it goes further than what other insurance representatives have said. not only would he not be covered, but wouldn't matter whether somebody else was negligent or not, would essentially be strict liability on the property owner who gave the
Surface?
easement. Is that
Or
correct,
the
Mr.
dock for
McLean,
the
is your
surface?
understanding?
Yes, that's my understanding.
The dock for the surface.
And I guess the final topic he would have testified to was his concern for his wife and him on having this pipeline near his property, and that they don't want pipeline under any circumstances on their land. Is that accurate, Mr. McLean?
Yes, it is.
So with that understanding, I can't ask him any further questions on this topic, so I don't have any further. I would offer exhibits 129 and 135.
Any objection to 129 or 135?
No objection to 129. On 135, I guess the objection would be that the issue of insurance has been previously addressed. I note that objection, it's fine to come in.
Mr. Fallon?
I have an objection to 129 insofar as it shows parents' attempted delivery issues. But the content of it relates to condemnation proceedings that the commission simply does not have jurisdiction over. And I think that portion of it is relevant. I don't have an objection to 135.
No.
Thank you.
All right, I will admit both exhibits. I'll note the objections, and the commission can give both documents the weight it deems, if any. Mr. Mulberg, did you have any questions?
Very briefly, Mr. McLean, if you look at the BC 129 in your book there, it's the FedEx cover page.
From here?
It looks like this.
Okay.
And I just want to make sure, I wasn't sure that I heard you correctly on this.
Okay.
This FedEx package, you're saying that someone from Summit threw it in your backyard? Or someone?
No, I didn't say Summit did. I said somebody drove in the yard in a white car. He's the only vehicle in the yard that's raining. He's the only tracks in the yard other than our own vehicle that had been moved from the day before. It was in the yard. That was the only tracks. This guy in a black coat walked across the yard and he came right back, went to his car, he backed out of the yard and left. Within 5 minutes, my wife was picking this up off the ground between the propane tank and the house in the grass, thinking it was something the dog drug up. It was soaking wet. I don't have it with me today because it was already in town. And it was a FedEx package.
Okay, and that, I just wanted to make sure you weren't saying that someone from Summit threw this in your backyard. You don't know how it got in the backyard. Okay, that's all. Thanks, Mr. McLean.
Mr. Fallon, any questions?
No questions. Thank you.
Mr. Jordy, any questions?
Your Honor, I don't have any questions. I would just note I can't see anything, and I'm hearing that the tech guy is talking at the same time. I'm hearing you all talking for reference, but no questions. Thank you, sir, for coming.
Your Honor, we're communicating with Mr. Jordy and he's having difficulties.
Yeah,
He might be completely off.
We're trying to join back in because he can't see us.
Is there any objection to proceeding with commission questions?
No objection.
All right. And I'll just note for the record, in case our recording didn't pick it up, Mr. Jordy did not have any questions for Mr. McLean. Commissioner Kurtzman, did you have any questions?
I don't think so, but I'll tell you, Mr. McLean, I know you sat through a lot of hours of these hearings.
So how do you want to join in?
Thank you for your interest and participation process. Thank you.
Commissioner Hogenhofer?
Yeah, I just need something clarified. You started answering the questions and then Mr. Bakke was directed to summarize. So, as I understood it, you had a first phone call in the fall of 2022, and I'm gonna summarize, and you can say if it's correct or not, and if it's not correct, you can correct me, okay? Fall of 2022, you didn't get a name, got a little heated, you don't know who's for first, and the use of eminent domain was used, and it was quote, you should get some money out of it. And then
Summarizing it, yes.
okay, but then there was another call, and almost the same thing was said, the use of eminent domain, and I believe that was 2022, 2023,
And somewhere in there, yeah.
correct? And that was with Dave Daring,
Well, I wouldn't say for sure.
okay,
The voice sounded like Dave.
okay, so you can't say for sure, but it was someone from Summit,
No, but it was from Summit. He said he was from Summit, never gave me a name.
okay,
None of them ever gave me a name.
okay. But it was almost the same type of, conversation, the use of eminent domain, and again, I believe it was summarized, again, get some money out of it. Is that correct? I mean, was there almost two conversations the same?
Well, they weren't really the same because Dave's a happy buffoon and, it was kind of that.
Can't keep the same
stuff
detail
like
on the
Dave
surface.
So, did you have a conversation with Dave?
It sounded like Dave.
Okay.
I don't know if it was Dave. I can't say for sure. He never gave me a name. So I wouldn't say for positive it was him.
Do I need to turn on?
There's a lot of people that sound alike.
That's true.
And
I have
and
no-
I do have a hearing problem.
I just wanted clarification on that. Thank you. I have no further questions.
Okay.
Mr. Dawson, any questions?
No question.
Mr. Baki, any redirect?
Well, just briefly, Mr. McLean, in terms of the FedEx envelope and the delivery, this vehicle that arrived, the white car, that was not a FedEx truck or vehicle, was it?
No, it was just a little white, probably mid-90s. It looked like, I was looking out the shop window. I just saw the real, I would guess it was something.
On the TVs, I just see that,
That's
that's
what it looked
back
like.
dust.
Okay, and this person didn't have a FedEx uniform on?
No, just that black coat on.
Okay, and you've had FedEx deliveries to your residence before, correct?
Yeah.
Also, and it comes in a FedEx truck with a FedEx driver and a uniform, correct?
Yeah.
That's all I have.
And you just put it inside the door.
Mr. Ballberg, any other questions?
No.
Mr. Pelham?
No questions.
Any other commission questions? All right, thank you, Mr. McLean.
Thank you.
And next witness is
Brian.
Mr. Bittner. I want to see if we can get the technology figured out before Mr. Bittner's testimony. Yeah, okay, so we're gonna take a short pause until
Yeah. we're
we
taking-
figure out
You wanna
the video
pop that?
and audio feed.
Your Honor, for what it's worth, Mr. Jordy's requesting that maybe it'll help if they just log out and log back in.
It's more of a problem than that, unfortunately, but he's coming down with another.
Okay.
Yeah, you can see.
out. So if everybody wants to get back to their seats. Mr. Bakke, you can formally call your next witness. Mr. Bittner, I'll have you start by stating your full name for the record and spelling your last name.
Brian Bittner, Bittner.
And Mr. Bittner, were you in the room earlier when I went through the penalties for perjury?
Yes, it was.
And do you understand what perjury is?
I do.
And being advised of the potential penalties for perjury, do you promise to tell the truth in this case today?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Bakke.
Thank you. Mr. Bittner, could you state your current position with Burleigh County?
I'm a current chairman of the Burleigh County Commission.
And just to refresh, how long have you been a Burleigh County Commissioner?
Just short of 16 years. I'm on the tail end of my 4th term.
And you testified previously regarding your concerns about the Summit pipeline under the original route being proposed by Summit in their application, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And have you seen the information in regards to the proposed reroute by Summit and been listening to some of the testimony throughout these hearings today and yesterday?
Yes.
Okay. Does Burleigh County have concerns regarding the proposed reroute location for the Summit pipeline?
Yes.
Okay. Could you tell the commissioners what Burleigh County's concerns are?
Well, first of all, we don't think that the pipeline should be in the location where it's at. We think that it's entirely too close to a lot of our Burleigh County residents. And based on conversations we've had at the county commission, we think that this reroute doesn't address some of our bigger concerns, which would be essentially schools. There's a number of schools along that particular path that is a big concern. And then the bigger concern would be the proximity to the water supply for Burleigh County. We rely on South Central Regional Water District to provide water for basically all of Burleigh County. And that particular location is super close to that. And then I guess it's not too far upstream from the city of Bismarck and the city of Mandan water supplies. So. I guess I could add a little bit more to that too. It appears to me that a lot of this reroute was because of this pipeline was running into some of the more wealthy developers in our area. You had John Warford, Chad Wachter, and Chad Moldenauer, and they've been doing real well for themselves over the years. But it concerns me as a Burleigh County Commissioner that now this reroute seems to be directed towards folks that maybe don't have the same kind of wherewithal that they did as far as hiring attorneys and representing them in that regard. And that's probably one of the biggest reasons why I support Burleigh County hiring counsel to represent Burleigh County.
You mentioned schools. What schools are you concerned about where you believe the Summit pipeline would still be too close?
I'd say every one of them. I don't necessarily know the names of each and every one, but there's Minokan, there's Apple Creek, there's, I think we have 6 or 7 rural schools in Burleigh County that I think are all too close to this pipeline.
Okay. And the proximity to the water supply, I believe you were here earlier today when you saw the map showing the distance from the South Central Regional Water Resource Intake, which was not quite 2.7 miles. Why is that a concern to Burleigh County?
Well, I think it's a concern based on my understanding of a source water protection area. In the state of North Dakota, we take great efforts at protecting our source water. And I understand that there's a source water protection area upstream of that water intake. And then we're supposed to look out for the safety of that.
And in which areas within Burleigh County does the South Central Water Resource District serve?
I don't know about the limits of their service area, but I would just have to guess that it's all of it.
And there's been testimony by Mr. Bazans in the April 22nd hearing that the proposed reroute does not impact any future growth plans in Burleigh County. Is that testimony accurate?
I don't think so.
Okay. And why not?
Well, for a couple of reasons. First of all, Burleigh County government is not in the business of planning developments or planning where landowners are going to make these decisions. That's kind of how they act in Russia. We don't operate that way. So we basically respond to subdivision applications and requests based on the landowner's desires. So we may not know about future plans. We have some sort of a planning document that kind of lays out some concepts, but there's nothing written in stone and there's nothing rigid about that. It's just some basic guidelines for people to consider. And I have heard comments from individuals on the reroute, and I don't have their names, but there's a couple of them have explained to me that there is their intention to develop their land at some point in the future. I didn't bother to write down their names, and that's my bad, because I suppose I talked to so many people. But since Burleigh County is not aware of it, but I've had people tell me that their intention is to develop land in that reroute area, so I have to take that as pretty much fact.
Mr. Bazans also testified that the state of North Dakota pays the taxes to Burleigh County related to the Summit pipeline, and Summit pays nothing. Is that accurate?
I believe so.
Okay. And he said Burleigh County gains tax revenue associated with the Summit pipeline if it were to be built. Is that accurate?
Well, I think that's a play on words, because first off, Burleigh County would get some property taxes from the state of North Dakota, but Burleigh County citizens pay taxes into the state of North Dakota. So I don't know that you could just say Burleigh County gains property taxes based on the Summit thing, because it's North Dakota money that's going to Burleigh County.
You mentioned the area outside of Bismarck and rural developments, and could you look at Burleigh County 101, the map that the Burleigh County GIS people put together and Mr. Flanagan testified about earlier today?
Okay.
Could you provide a few more details in regards to that 4 mile, what's been termed a buffer?
Right. Yeah, I can, because actually 17 or 18 years ago, that ETA issue is exactly why I'm sitting before you here today. That was the issue that affected me the most, because I was in the ETA area of the city of Bismarck, and I didn't appreciate the law that formed that. And so I actually went to work and was successful in getting that law somewhat changed to where instead of the 4 mile ETA, what has been referred to as a buffer area, that has no basis in the history. Originally, Bismarck had a 2 mile extraterritorial jurisdiction. There's a state law that says a city may extend its zoning jurisdiction a certain distance outside the city limits based on population. So every city is different. Lincoln, for example, is a smaller area than Bismarck would be, but based on Bismarck's population, they were able to, by ordinance, extend the ETA out 4 miles. And that's when it affected me, because when I bought my property 37 years ago, my property line was the existing ETA of the city of Bismarck. And I knew that full well. So I purchased land right on the outside of that ETA for my own personal reasons. But then they were allowed to extend that to 4 miles. And that's when it affected me. And that's when I got involved. And I ended up becoming appointed to the advisory commission on intergovernmental relations by the governor. And I sat on a lot of those meetings. And we were able to get the law changed to where now from the 2 to 4, we have a joint powers agreement with the city of Bismarck that Burleigh County is the lead jurisdiction in the 2 to 4 mile. So the city of Bismarck exerts zoning control in the 0 to 2, and the 2 to 4 falls under Burleigh County zoning jurisdiction. Now, just to be clear, there's so many similarities between the ordinances because for a long time, the city of Bismarck, and for good reason, was actually doing the planning and zoning for all of the city of Bismarck plus Burleigh County, because Burleigh County did not have their own planning and zoning department. Now, it was myself, mostly me and one other commissioner, that we went to work and we actually created the Burleigh County Planning and Zoning Department so that nobody could say, gee, the county doesn't have a planning and zoning department. We need, the city out there doing that. And we actually terminated the city of Bismarck. They offered to do this much cheaper than we could even do it ourselves. And the problems that we were having in the ETA were relative to the planning and zoning. Burleigh County has spent millions of dollars repairing problems in these rural subdivisions outside and around the city limits that the city is able to basically wash their hands of these decisions. They'll approve these rural subdivisions, and then when there's problems, and literally millions of dollars worth of problems, and I can certainly provide a list if you would like, but we're out there correcting drainage and bad culverts and roads not working. And anyway, it has been just a giant cluster. And we said enough is enough. And so we're pushing back on that particular issue right now, even today. So I wanted to make sure that you didn't think that that buffer area was something that wasn't relative, because at this point, according to our agreement with the city, this agreement can be canceled at any point. So the city extraterritorial jurisdiction technically is at the 4 mile line. And another reason why that's significant is when we were developing the ordinance that was saying this hazardous liquid pipeline is going to be a minimum of 10 miles away from the ETA line, I meant, because I was helping write it, I meant the 4 mile line. So that essentially we didn't want that pipeline anywhere within 14 miles of the city limits of Bismarck. And I'll tell you why. Because at the time, when I first started hearing about this pipeline stuff, I really didn't see it as a threat. I recognize in North Dakota that we have a lot of pipelines. There's pipelines that ran right past the place that I spent most of my childhood, out on the farm. I didn't really see it as a problem. It wasn't until a meeting that included Summit and their lawyer, where the lawyer handed me this report from the Satarsha, Mississippi incident. And so I went home with that report and I started reading it, and I went, uh-oh, this is a problem. Because in that report, you may recall, somebody else testified to you, and they sat here and they had a Burleigh County map, and then they had that red plume thing. And I think it was you, sir, that asked them who made that? How did that get created or whatever? Well, I can tell you how that got created. I did it. Because I took that Satarsha, Mississippi government report, factual government report, that told us that that plume from Satarsha, Mississippi traveled 33 kilometers. And so I looked up in the book, and that's 18.6 miles.
Your Honor, I'm going to object.
Heading
down the road of Satarsha. We know about Satarsha. We've heard the testimony.
You haven't heard mine.
That's my objection, Your Honor.
Your Honor, the proceeding is the objections are made and you rule on the objections. The witness doesn't have the opportunity to interject during objections. It's not appropriate.
I'll give you that.
And Mr. Bittner, we've heard a lot about Satarsha in the previous hearings, and all of that is still part of the record. So I don't know. I don't even remember what question was posed to you, but perhaps Mr. Bakke could ask his next question.
Well,
So I think we kind of went down the road pretty far there.
Well, it has to do with the effect of this plume model discussion on Bismarck and Burley County.
Mr. Bakke, please ask your next question.
Sure. So let me ask you, you've been here listening to testimony or not being permitted to ask questions about the dispersion model by Summit. Were you present at the meeting with the Summit representatives on November 27, 2023 that Ms. Singer attended as well?
Yes,
Okay.
I was.
Okay.
And that's part of why I want to talk about the plume model stuff.
Okay. And so what are your concerns in regards to the plume model?
Okay, there's certain specific models for plume model. And I'm basically frustrated that this commission has been convinced that somehow that plume model information should not be disclosed to the public.
Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Commissioner Bittner is not an expert in plume modeling. It appears he's heading down the path of his knowledge in plume modeling. The commission has issued its order on Summit's dispersion modeling information. We covered this with Ms. Singer. We're heading down the same path.
Mr. Bittner, you can give us in a very general, short summary of what your concerns are. But again, we've already discussed the plume modeling. We've already talked about how the commission doesn't have jurisdiction over safety.
I know all that.
And I understand you want to provide us more than that, but
Right.
we
Well,
just don't have the.
Okay, briefly, we have a list here of approved plume model programs. The plume model program that Summit used is not even on the list. This thing here, this documentation says, documentation should note that FEMA manages the Interagency Modeling and Atmospheric Response Center, which is called IMAC. IMAC provides plume models for real-world emergencies involving significant hazardous atmospheric releases and atmospheric modeling support for national level exercises and local exercises. State, local, and federal officials can request IMAC support by contacting this IMAC technical hubs managed by these Defense Threat Reduction Agency at this phone number or emailing this IMAC at fema.dhs.gov. And so, you know, we would have that available. I think you have, the reason I'm bringing it up is I think you've been misinformed on this, because on the next page here, it says that this program was run using Aloha. Now, Aloha is a plume modeling software that's used by the city of Bismarck, which informs the Bismarck Rural Fire in the event of an emergency that requires a response. So they will do the plume modeling in-house using Aloha. And so Aloha was selected for this here particular thing because its attributes are highly effective for emergency preparedness and response. Aloha is a free software and was developed and supported by the Atmospheric Response Division, ERD, a division within the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, in collaboration with the Office of Emergency Management of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And so these things are available to us as a government agency for free and with support. So for them to do this objecting and all that stuff relative to plume models, I think is disingenuous, and it's not fair to you folks.
On the topic of safety, because I just heard the judge say that the PSC has no jurisdiction over safety. So let me phrase it a little bit different way, because I understand two of the issues to be addressed by the PSC in relation to the reroute is that the construction, operation, and maintenance of the Summit pipeline at the proposed location should produce minimal adverse effects on the environment and upon the welfare of the citizens of North Dakota. And do you view in your role as the Burleigh County chairman, the welfare of the citizens to include health and safety?
Absolutely.
Okay. And then another issue to be addressed is, will the construction, operation, and maintenance of the facility at the proposed location minimize adverse human and environmental impacts? And do you consider safety and health of the citizens of Burleigh County to potentially be impacted in an adverse sort of way if the Summit pipeline is constructed?
Yes, I think they could be negatively impacted.
Okay. So let's move on to another topic. And I just want to cover this briefly because there was some questions with Mr. Flanagan in relation to whether he was taking a position on his concerns about the southern alternative route proposed by Summit or studied by Summit, or whether he is speaking on behalf of Burleigh County. And so you're the county chairman, so you can speak on behalf of Burleigh County.
Yes.
Have you looked at, and you can look at exhibit Burleigh County 102 at the proposed southern alternative route by Summit, and can you describe what concerns, if any, Burleigh County has about the southern alternative route considered or studied by Summit?
Well, based on my understanding of what can happen in the event of a problem, I would be fighting that southern route like I was the third monkey on the ramp to Noah's Ark and it was starting to rain, because we have too many people. We have a lot of wind from the south. We got an airport. We got the University of Mary. And not only that, my son and his wife and my grandchildren live right there. And I would have a serious problem with running through there. And I can tell you, based on my experience as a Missouri River fisherman, that if you had to pick a route that you knew was never going to fly and never get approved, that would be it. Because there's absolutely not any place that's as bad for a route in Burleigh County, well, essentially as the two routes they've chosen. They're just, you couldn't pick a worse route if you tried. I'm sorry, that's a long answer.
Let's turn to the topic of electrical supply for the Summit pipeline. And if you look at Burleigh County 103, that's the map of Capital Electric that provides the areas in Burleigh County, or at least some of them, served by Capital Electric and the ones served by MDU. And what concerns do you have, if any, on behalf of Burleigh County in relation to electrical supply issues for the Summit pipeline in Burleigh County?
Well, thanks for that question. Again, this is going to be kind of a long answer. For probably the last, 15 years or more, I've served on a number of committees with Capital Electric. The Members Advisory Committee, the Nominating Committee, the Elections Committee, the Credentials Committee. So I've been involved with Capital Electric more or less for quite a long time. And so it occurred to me, based on my experience with hazardous liquid gas, that a power outage of some sort could have a real catastrophic result in Burleigh County. And the reason, see, I grew up out in the country, and at one time in my age, in my young age, we were stormed in for 3 days without power. And it was just my dad and I, and we had a fireplace, so we were okay. But I said, when the day comes when I'm in charge, we're going to have a generator, because we're just not going to have that problem. So now today, I own 4 different generators, so that if the power goes out at either my place or my son's place, both of them are set up with 2 different generators. One's gas and one's propane in case the gas doesn't work. But that was so that I could make sure that we had power. And so I'm thinking about the pipeline, saying, what happens if these pump stations lose power? Because in review of a bunch of research, I found out that there's a critical point in these pipelines that if a compressor goes out and the power outage leads to a problem, you can have a significant operational problem in this pipeline. If it gets below like 1,000 or 1,200 PSI, it starts to change phase from the supercritical to the gas phase. And what that does is it changes the entire volume inside the pipe.
Objection, Your Honor. I don't believe any foundation has been laid for this witness as an expert in pipeline construction or operation. We're getting detailed analysis of pipeline construction and operation from Commissioner Bittner.
Well, I testified before that I am an expert in that, but that's okay.
Maybe you can just give us a general overview of your concerns, Mr. Bittner.
So the concern is that we have had many power outages since in the 37 years that I've owned my property. I've probably had 15 power outages. So we know what happens. And then I asked Capital Electric, I said, so if we have this brownout or blackout situation, because I think we've all at our levels been hearing that there's a problem with capacity in the grid for electricity here in North Dakota. We have the Southwest Power Pool issue. And back in February 2019, I mean, you may recall this, that the temperatures are getting towards 20 below and the wind turbines all shut down because of the cold temperature. So the coal-fired power plants were on laydown because we were using the wind power. And then the gas peaking plants that were supposed to kick in to replace that power that the wind turbines were making couldn't come up because apparently the gas valves up and down between here and the Bakken were froze up. And so they couldn't fire those up. And here we are, an energy producing state like North Dakota that you all know well, the electrical generation issues here, that all of a sudden we had no power of our own. And we paid dearly for that, the way I understand. I don't know, Commissioner Howden-Hoffert might have better information about what that caused. But so the answer is that these electric concerns that we have, we heard testimony that Summit doesn't so much as have anything more than a solar panel backup on these valves. My history is in those electromechanical systems and hydraulics and gas and computer technology is my background. And we're putting Burleigh County citizens all at risk with very minimal, essentially no backup. I have more generating capacity in my shop than this company seems to have. And so what do you do in the event of a power outage? I'd personally like to know that because I don't think that we're getting straight information here based on all the testimony that I've sat through.
And have you heard any testimony or seen any documents from Summit that identify what would happen if the pipeline lost power, and in particular the main valves that are identified for to be located in Burleigh County?
The only thing I recall on that was testimony yesterday from Mr. Powell that said that would be catastrophic.
Objection, and I think that's a mischaracterization of the testimony.
Well, the record will reflect what the testimony provided.
Other than the solar power that Mr. Backup at the valve itself is what I understood from Mr. Powell, are you aware of any other backup electrical supply that Summit plans or has specified for the Summit pipeline?
No.
Have you contacted Capital Electric to determine whether they have any limitations on the power they can provide for the Summit pipeline or throughout Burleigh County?
Yes.
Okay. And what have they indicated in that regard?
Well, they don't have the capability to just instantly fix lines that are broke down in the wintertime, winter storms and whatnot that take down power lines. Just flat out take out the infrastructure. And so there's really no backup. I mean, they can route around certain areas. I know that from those conversations. I guess I should also point out, because somebody asked me, that in the event of a brownout or a blackout situation, who gets cut first, the residents or the industrial uses? So in what Capital Electric manager, Paul, what he told me is that the industrial users are the first ones that get cut in the event of a brownout or a blackout or something. So their goal, according to policy of Capital Electric, is to provide power to the residents and the homes rather than the industrial uses.
There was testimony by Mr. Powell yesterday that there was simply, at least in his opinion, without contacting any of the governmental entities or other entities that had jurisdiction or involvement south of Bismarck, that there was simply no path that was even possible south of Bismarck for the Summit Pipeline to go and cross the Missouri River south of Bismarck. Do you believe that is accurate?
No.
And why not?
Well, because they put a dappled pipeline in down across the river. Didn't seem to be any problem. And I know that stretch of river really well, because in the past I've had time to fish. I don't have much time anymore, but I had time to fish. And there's a lot of areas south of Bismarck where you could put a pipeline. Wouldn't necessarily be close to the reservation, wouldn't necessarily have to be close to Bismarck. But there's a lot of areas that I've seen that you could put a pipeline. I do want to point out, and at early on, John Warford asked me to attend a meeting, and this would have been at Randy Baki's office. And in that meeting, there was, I think, 3 or 4 Summit people. And I asked the question of Summit at that point is, why won't you put the pipeline further south to the south of Bismarck? And the response was, we don't want to have another DAPL. And commissioners, that's not a very good answer. They were worried about the optics apparently, and they just didn't want to have a DAPL. But yet we'll go ahead and we'll put this pipeline near the biggest population center in this area of the state. I'm sorry, I just can't agree with that.
Switching topics, could you look at BC 109? That is the dispersion model that Summit did for the state of Minnesota. That's a publicly available document on a 4-inch feeder pipeline. What, if any information did that provide to Burleigh County to assess welfare of the citizen and adverse minimal impact issues for the citizens of Burleigh County?
I don't think this provided very good information for me.
Okay.
I mean, mainly because we're talking about a totally different pipeline in a totally different area. And I think, if I remember right, this was a 4-inch pipeline.
Correct.
And here in Burleigh County, we're talking about a 24-inch pipeline, which, in case you didn't know, and I'll go ahead and tell you that the volume in a 4-inch pipeline, it takes 88.2 4-inch pipelines to equal the volume in a 24-inch pipeline. So if these guys were all concerned about accidental releases from a 4-inch pipe, well, you just magnify that by 88.2. And that's why that doesn't do much for me.
Did you have a chance to review the expert testimony of a geologist in Iowa, Ryan Clark, who provided testimony on the Summit Pipeline hearings in Iowa?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And Did you find anything in his testimony to be significant that you think should be considered by the PSC in this matter?
Yes, I did.
Okay, and what was that?
Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay. Mr. Clark's not here to be cross-examined, and we're backdooring some testimony right now.
It's sworn testimony that was provided in a public proceeding. It's not
In Iowa,
hearsay.
Your Honor.
It's not hearsay. It's sworn testimony in a public proceeding. That's not hearsay.
But you're not producing that witness, but you want to get the statements into that witness?
No, he reviewed the entire testimony.
I found it myself, Your Honor. I was reviewing.
Well, that's not the problem. The problem is if you're going to provide the statements as somebody that testified in Iowa for the validity of what those statements are, and that person's not here to be cross-examined, that's the problem. So,
I have an answer for that.
well, your attorney needs to address it.
Yeah, I can ask it to you a different way.
Okay.
Do you know if any of the other states that this Summit pipeline is proposed to go through have geology that would permit CO2 to be stored in those states rather than shipping it to North Dakota?
Yes, based on my research, similar geology exists in Iowa and I believe Illinois as well.
There's been some testimony about PHMSA and the issue of whether PHMSA speaks to whether dispersion modeling information should be kept confidential or has to be kept confidential. Have you looked at documents in that regard to see what position PHMSA takes on dispersion modeling?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And you have in front of you exhibit 32, landowners exhibit 32.
That'd be in this one.
That'd be in that one.
Okay, yes, I do.
Okay. And what information in there from PHMSA Representative Sean Quinlan has any significance on the issue of plume modeling information for CO2 pipelines?
Well,
Objection, Your Honor. This has been asked and answered. We went over this exhibit yesterday. I don't think Mr. Commissioner Bittner needs to read in and talk about this statement once again.
I agree. We went over all this yesterday. So if you have new questions about this, that's fine, but we addressed all this yesterday. So we need to move on.
I don't think that was anybody on behalf of Burleigh County. That was on behalf of Mr. Jordy was asking Mr. Powell about this from Summit's perspective. Now I'm asking about Burleigh County's perspective on this issue of the availability of plume model information and why they believe that information should be available to the public. Mr. Powell took the position that PHMSA does not indicate it should be released, or takes a position that it should not be released, that somehow it's some national security threat or otherwise. These documents contradict that and help explain why Burleigh County is requesting that the public, for their own safety, preparedness, and protection, can see the plume model information to be prepared in the event of a CO2 leak. And so I think it is important to get Burleigh County's perspective on this. This is my last topic. We're ahead of schedule now. I think it's important that the PSC consider the Burleigh County's perspective on this issue.
Well, wouldn't you agree this is more relevant to your motion to reconsider the protective order than it is the topics we're here to talk about today?
I'm not saying it's not relevant, but it's a topic that's already been discussed. And yesterday, Mr. Powell took a position that appears to be directly contrary to what PHMSA has said in their own documents. So it's also impeachment of what Mr. Powell said.
Mr. Pelham, do you have any thoughts on behalf of the commission? I mean, my my thought is this is what the motion is requesting, and I think we address it through the motion practice rather than with hearing testimony on it today.
This isn't a very good procedural response, but I think we know what Commissioner Bittner is going to say. It's been covered. There's a dispute over whether or not the plume modeling that's been deemed to be protected information per a motion that was made in an order issued in August of 2023 that has been in place. And we have a motion for reconsideration that was filed the day before the start of the hearings. I'm not sure, all due respect to Commissioner Bittner, I know he has an opinion on it, but whether or not that is going to move us forward on it, I don't necessarily think it will.
Can I say something?
No. The document, landowners, I'm getting confused with the two exhibit numbers. Landowner 32 was admitted yesterday. It says what it says. It speaks for itself. I think we've already established Burleigh County's position that they believe the plume model should be public information. So we need to move past this because we are covering the same ground repeatedly on the plume modeling. So I am going to sustain the objection.
Okay, and for our offer of proof, we would have had him discuss a landowner exhibit 32 and 33. Can I ask him why Burleigh County believes it would be advisable for the plume model information, dispersion modeling information to be made available to the public from Burleigh County's perspective?
If you can tell me how his answer is going to be any different than Ms. Singer's answer, didn't she address all of that?
She addressed it from an emergency management and preparedness standpoint. I don't know what he's going to say, whether it goes beyond that or whether it's limited to that.
Were you, Mr. Bittner, you were here from Ms. Singer's testimony, correct?
Yes, I was.
Are your concerns any different than hers?
I think so.
So I'm going to ask you not to repeat what she's already stated, but if you have independent concerns, you can share those.
Okay, this kind of.
Go ahead.
Okay. This speaks to something I mentioned earlier. I think you folks as the Public Service Commission were misinformed in earlier testimony. One of the first hearings that we had here in Bismarck, somebody that apparently worked for PHMSA was telling you that PHMSA would consider that plume model stuff to be privileged information based on critical infrastructure. And I think you probably took the guy's word for it because he was a previous PHMSA employee. But then we come to find out these folks actually sent letters to these companies saying that's just not the case. So the point here is that I think the bigger point is I think you folks have been misled. Not that we know everything we need to know at this point about plume models and about CO2 and whatnot. It's not going to change one little thing that we do in Burleigh County, to be honest with you. We've got professionals on the job, and that plume model means nothing anymore. Now it's just the point that they're trying to hide it. And what's the point in hiding it when the government themselves tells us you should share that so you do appropriate risk management planning and things like that? I'm offended that the North Dakota Public Service Commission has been manipulated over that one little issue. I'm sorry, but as a Burleigh County Commissioner, I think it's appropriate for me to point that out, even though there's objections and the whole thing to that plume model stuff. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Mr. Bittner, any other concerns on behalf of Burleigh County with the current route of the Summit Pipeline that you haven't addressed already? I know we've gone through this in pretty rapid fire fashion.
One thing, I know it's been touched on, and I don't want to spend much time on it, but we heard in initial testimony from, I believe it's North Dakota Geological Survey, that there was 11 sites in Burleigh County that were possible subsidence or landslide areas. We know that Burleigh County has a lot of landslide areas here, and this reroute apparently jumped that number up to 18, and that certainly amplified my concerns.
I have no further questions.
Mr. Glut?
Briefly, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Commissioner Bittner, you just accused the Public Service Commission of being misled. We received testimony last Friday from a witness that testified that Mr. Bittner had told this witness that upon completion of Summit's storage project and the end of the tax credits, that you told your constituents that their property, pore space rights, and their surface rights were going to be transferred to the state. Is that true?
No, I didn't say pore space rights.
Did you say surface land rights?
No, I didn't say surface land rights. I'm talking about title to the land.
Oh,
And by the
title-
way,
excuse me,
I'm
Mr.
not
Bittner. Excuse me, Mr. Bittner.
accusing the PSC of being misled. It was Summit and their witnesses that I think was misleading the PSC.
So at a Burley County Commission meeting,
Mhm.
you indicated to those in attendance
Mhm.
that at the completion of Summit storage project,
No, I wasn't
That
talking about
title-
Summit. I wasn't talking about Summit in any way, shape, or form.
okay, let's say at a completion of a carbon dioxide storage facility project, that when that's completed,
Mhm.
their title to their land would be transferred to the state, is what you told your constituents.
That's not accurate. That's not an accurate depiction of what I said.
So that witness was lying?
I didn't say that. I said what you just said wasn't an accurate thing. What I said was based on 38-22 of the North Dakota Century Code, information that I got from a senator, a sitting senator, that he got from counsel for the North Dakota Legislative Council. So this 38-22 says that at the end or the completion of a project, depending on whenever that is, it basically starts a clock. And the Industrial Commission, they can apply, I believe, for a certificate of completion. And then after a period of 10 years, according to North Dakota Century Code 38-22, title to the storage facility, which is defined in that law as pore space, title to the storage facility and the stored substances transfers to the state of North Dakota without payment of any compensation.
Are you aware of an email that was sent to the Mercer County State's Attorney, the Oliver County State's Attorney, that repeated my phrasing of what you said to the state's attorneys?
No, I'm not aware of that.
Are you a lawyer, Mr. Bittner? Commissioner Bittner?
No, I'm not.
Are you an expert in PHMSA federal regulations?
Well, I'm kind of getting to be like that from so much of this.
Are you an expert in electrical grid and power supply?
No.
Are you an expert in plume modeling?
Getting there.
I have no further questions.
Mr. Pelham, any questions?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, Commissioner. Having been at many hearings, and I know you've attended many as well, there seems to be just a simple breakdown, complete breakdown in communication between Burley County and Summit. Would that be a fair statement?
I'd say so, sir. It's almost become a joke at Burley County Commission meetings. You know that now, every time we have a meeting, there's going to be some commissioner that says, "Hey, is there anybody from Summit in the room?"
Okay, fair enough. And I don't know if this will move the ball forward at all, but if you could identify from the commission standpoint or you individually, what it is a potential path forward for establishing a relationship, or perhaps reestablishing or creating a relationship between Burley County and Summit?
Yeah,
Objection, relevance.
Objection is noted. I'll allow him to answer.
Okay. I actually had a conversation with Summit representatives about that. And mainly our objection is proximity to Bismarck, whether it's north or south. That's clear. You know, we're worried about how do we protect the citizens in the event, whether it's unlikely or not, but how do we save our people? So I said, well, can you just go further away? And they said, well, where do you think we should move it to? And I said, I think the people will tell you that. Eventually, you're going to get to some place where the people are not opposed to that. They don't look at their land as future developable land that in their reasonable lifetime and such. I think that there's too much focus. It's almost as if they drew a line in the sand, and that's the only thing for consideration. They haven't budged. I mean, the in and out is still the same, right? Now, all they've done is curved it up a little bit further north, which probably can't be fought as effectively as it was fought right here by Bismarck, but the end result is still the same. So I think that they could move that and work with landowners, because I do know that in Burleigh County, there is a route. We were accused of basically zoning them out. And that wasn't the point at all. There is clear paths in Burleigh County where, first off, we don't have the jurisdiction. We couldn't stop them if we wanted to. But they didn't investigate any of that. It didn't bother asking any of our people. I mean, we've got professionals that are involved in this stuff. You know, I'm just the big dummy, I guess, that gets to speak, but I already tried that with them.
Appreciate that response, sir. Southwest Water Resources, did you say Southwest Water Resources? South Central, sorry.
Regional
South
Water.
Central Regional Water. They have a board, right?
A board?
A board.
I think so.
And have you or anyone to your knowledge, Burleigh County had any discussions with them related to the proposed route?
I think so, but I don't remember who would have contacted them or what the response would have been. I heard something about that.
And early on in your testimonies here today, sir, you're testifying as to some individuals who came up to you, and you didn't recall their names. So I'm not going to ask about that. But as far as development of land on the proposed reroute area, can you tell Commission whether or not there's any current plans for development of subdivisions along the proposed reroute at present?
We don't have any applications today that I'm aware of.
All right.
All that was conversation that people told me that was their intentions.
Fair enough. Thank you, sir. No further questions.
Welcome.
Mr. Jordy, any questions?
Yes, Your Honor, I've got some questions. Mr. Bittner, you were asked by Summit's counsel if you were an expert in PHMSA regulations. My question, sir, is can you read English?
Yes, sir.
And have you been reading English for several decades?
Yes, sir. That's been I guess I can go off on that tangent just a little bit. All my life, I've had this thing that was considered that I considered to be a blessing and a curse. I read at an extremely high level, and the comprehension is very high, and I was blessed with a near photographic memory. So from the earliest time that I can remember, I've been wanting to learn how everything works. And that's the reason for my technological background, is because I could never get enough reading. Fortunately, now that I'm getting a little older, it is slowing down. But yes, I can read English.
And so you've no doubt become aware that PHMSA is responsible for regulating the safe transportation of hazardous materials through safety standards. And so they have federal minimum safety standards like length of pipe, thickness of pipe, number of welds, and those things. Have you come to understand that?
Yes.
And you understand that the safety standard to a federal minimum of how something should be built has nothing to do with where that thing may or may not be located.
That's correct.
And so when the statement
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, my understanding from reading English is that, you know, the PHMSA really kind of talks about the locals actually having that jurisdiction.
Well, and so during your testimony, or when you've been on the stand, the statement was made that the PSC has no jurisdiction safety. However, as a Burleigh County commissioner, is it your request that safety considerations and factors related to safety and risk are taken into account when deciding whether or not the proposed summit route is in an intelligent location or not?
Well, I would ask for that, yeah, and I understand that people, kind of stand behind the law and said, well, the law says this is what we need to do. But I think we should keep in mind that same law was put in place years ago. Nobody ever considered a CO2 pipeline in regards to the pipeline laws in North Dakota. Those were all, everybody knows that an oil pipeline or a natural gas pipeline or something has these certain minimal risks. We live with that every day.
And have you come to understand that the federal pipeline construction specifications as to how something can be operated, maintained, or initially built, that those apply regardless of where a developer proposes to locate such a pipeline?
Yes.
And so have you concluded that safety standards are very different than the mere concept of considering safety concerns when potentially routing hazardous infrastructure?
I would agree. I think
now,
that,
go ahead.
My understanding is that PHMSA is currently reevaluating those standards for carbon dioxide pipelines. And I think that's for good reason. I don't know what they're going to come up with, but I do know that based on information we've been presented, that they're redoing those regulations apparently because there's deficiencies.
Along those lines, sir, were you aware that yesterday the state legislature of Illinois, both the House and the Senate, voted to ban all new CO2 projects until the federal government sets forth new safety rules?
Objection, relevance.
I did not know that.
Objection is noted. I don't think we need to go down that line of questioning, Mr. Jordy. I'll allow Mr. Bittner's answer to that one question stand, but I don't think we need to explore further what other states are doing.
You said that Summit representatives stated to you in apparently a justification of why they were proposing to go so close to the populated center of Bismarck that, quote, we, meaning Summit, don't want another DAPL. Was that your testimony?
Yes, sir.
And so, I mean, did you take that to be that they didn't want a standoff with Native Americans, so they figured it'd be easier to run the route through Burleigh County? Or, I mean, how did you take that?
That's exactly how I took it. Of course, my response was, I'll just wait until 100,000 people in Burleigh County get upset about this. And just so you know, the person that, in case anybody wants to check, but the person that said that to me was Jeff Scarry.
And then Mr. Pellin had asked you about a breakdown in communication with between Burleigh County and Summit. And now, sir, related to any breakdown, whether it's relevant or not, do you attribute at least some of that to Summit's ongoing and consistent lack of transparency on how they've dealt with this project?
I guess my opinion on that is that they just thought they were going to run over North Dakota. They were going to run over Burleigh County. They didn't bother even saying, would you mind? I mean, we don't have any problem communicating with people that want to develop things in Burleigh County. I think we're open. We're certainly open for business. We look out for the citizens. They just didn't connect with us.
Understood, sir. I appreciate your testimony. No further questions.
Commissioner Chrisman?
I'm not going to be like Brian Jordy and put you on the spot about something that happened in Illinois yesterday, but just generally in Burleigh County, do you typically copy whatever Cook County, Illinois does?
No, absolutely not.
I didn't think so. Getting more to this case though, instead of straying in those kinds of directions as Mr. Jordy was doing. You mentioned pipeline laws being in place for many years before the CO2 pipeline concept came up, right? But isn't it right that since this has been a big topic in North Dakota, we had a regular legislative session and we had a special legislative session, and neither one chose to change these laws in regards to CO2 pipeline siting?
I'm not aware of that, but I'll take your word for it, sir.
In Burley County and Bismarck, has there been concerns about other developments going in that are large energy users in regards to this perceived energy capacity shortage?
I think that's something we would be more inclined to consider now that we know about it. I think this snuck up on all of us here in North Dakota. It wasn't until the advent of these data centers and whatnot that we started to realize the precariousness of the grid.
Like some of the developments going up north that I drive by every time back and forth to home. Nobody's restrained anything there with it.
Not yet, but I do think that that's a valid concern moving forward.
I think you might have said 14 miles, but how far? So you've got the Bismarck city limit, you've got the ETA, you've got that 4 mile, whatever it was called. How far out of Bismarck do you want this? What would be?
Well, I was trying to have a little balance on that, because I looked at for example, that 18.5 mile plume from Starch, Mississippi, that followed terrain and whatnot. And I believe that the CO2 is most hazardous close in. But based on just that one, I thought, to me, it was trying to strike a balance between not go to the end of that 18.6 miles, but at least some distance that acknowledges that it's, in the event of an accident, is dangerous to that. I said 14 just because.
So 14, I looked at but Burley County's Exhibit 104. So 14 would take you out a little past McKenzie, right?
I would suppose so, yes.
And I'm sure you care about the people of Driscoll just as much as you care about the people of Bismarck.
Yes,
what if they want a 14 mile setback? Then there's nowhere through Burley County anymore.
I recognize that, sir.
And even if they didn't, as you would go around and get north of Bismarck, based on this Burley County Exhibit 104, there's kind of a hodgepodge of townships with Burley County zoning jurisdiction. So there'd be nowhere, even if you didn't want to cross, if you wanted to go further north to find a river crossing, you couldn't get through out east of Wilton anywhere either without being within far less than within 3 miles of a Burley County zoning jurisdiction township, correct?
I don't think so. I think there's a clear path through those townships where they have their own zoning jurisdiction that is not under Burley County control. That I think they could find a way. Obviously, the best answer if it just wasn't in North Dakota at all.
Okay. And the last thing, you said they couldn't have picked 2 worse spots than what are on the table between what's really on the table and the south route. Is the route that's really on the table, is that worse than the original route, or is it marginally better?
It seems to be the same to me. It's got the same starting and the same end point. Just the fact that you looped it a little further north doesn't address the concerns I would have based on everything that we know.
Thank you. No other questions?
Commissioner Haugenhofer.
I'm going to expand upon that. The concerns that you have or the county commission?
Both. I am speaking for the Burley County Commission. We discussed that at county commission meeting because of the need to make decisions quickly and move along with the lawyer and anything else, that I have that that okay from the Burleigh County Commission.
I have no further questions.
Mr. Dawson,
No questions.
any redirect?
Just briefly, Your Honor, and in terms of the 14 miles that Burleigh County is requesting the Summit Pipeline be moved further away from Bismarck, that would be from the Bismarck existing city limits, is that correct?
No, that would have been from 10 miles from the 4 miles. So it would have been 14 miles from the city limits.
Okay. And that request by Burleigh County, is that request being made to the PSC so that there would be minimal adverse impacts and effects on the welfare of the citizens of North Dakota and in particular Burleigh County?
I can't really speak to whether we're asking the PSC for that, but that was what had to do with the Burleigh County ordinances. But I guess I hadn't really considered whether we should make that request, but that was the underlying information for the zoning ordinances.
But that's what the Burleigh County Commission would like to see.
Yes.
Regardless of who the ultimate decision maker is.
Yes.
And do you believe there would be less adverse human and environmental impact if it was moved further away to more rural townships and locations?
You know, I think it would have less of an impact on the city of Bismarck and the population concentration. But it seems like no matter where we would have it in North Dakota, it's going to affect people. And I really don't want anybody affected based on what I know about it.
Okay. And that 14 miles from the city limits, that would be in every direction from Bismarck, north, south, east, west.
Yes.
Okay. In regards to a path through Burleigh County where the pipeline could be built further away, could you take a look at Burleigh County 104?
Okay.
And that identifies townships where Burleigh County has zoning jurisdiction and ones that are identified as civil townships. And what's the difference?
The Burleigh County zoning jurisdiction applies to either unorganized townships or townships that have delegated their zoning authority to Burleigh County.
And so if we look at just the civil townships, that's somewhere where Burleigh County does not have zoning jurisdiction.
Correct.
Okay. And can you see that there would be multiple paths around Bismarck to the east and to the north where the Summit Pipeline could go, where Burleigh County has no zoning jurisdiction?
Yes, that's what I referred to earlier.
Okay, that would be the white townships?
Yes.
Okay. And then if we take some of the more northern townships in Burleigh County, where Burleigh County does have zoning jurisdiction, the pink ones such as Canfield, Phoenix, Florence Lake, are there those ones where if Burleigh County did have a say in where the Summit Pipeline could be located, where Burleigh County zoning might say those locations in certain parts of those townships would be acceptable or more acceptable than it is now?
Well, I think we would certainly consider it. We have ample room in the zoning ordinances for variances and waivers and different things that that make a lot of that possible. Yes.
And as you sit here today, are there any specific constraints that you're aware of that would prevent the Summit Pipeline from going through these civil townships further to the east and then going to the north?
A little humor. Years ago in that Rock Hill Township, I had to go up there and haul a crashed airplane home with my semi. I wouldn't recommend going through Rock Hill. It's just too rocky.
Other than that?
No.
Okay. Okay. I have nothing further.
Mr. Glut, any additional questions?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. Pelham?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. Jordy?
No, thank you.
Any other questions from the commissioners or Mr. Dawson? All right, thank you, Mr. Bittner. All right, next witness.
Yep, Your Honor, the landowners will call Dr. Mark Jacobson, who looks like he's with us remotely here. Can you hear us, Doctor?
Yes, I can hear you.
Wonderful.
Dr. Jacobson, I'll have you start by stating your full name for the record and spelling your last name.
Yeah, it's Mark Zachary Jacobson, Jacobson.
Dr. Jacobson, before you testify, I'm required by law to advise you on the penalties for perjury in the state of North Dakota. Perjury is a Class C felony punishable by a maximum fine of $10,000, a maximum 5 years imprisonment, or both. Do you understand what perjury is?
Yes.
In being advised of the potential penalties for perjury, do you promise to tell the truth in this case today?
Yes, I do.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Jordy.
Yes, Dr. Jacobson, did you cause to be prepared some what's known as pre-filed or written testimony in the form of questions and answers to be used as a summary of your opinions in this matter?
Yes, I did.
And along with the question and answers, the written question and answers, you supplied a few attachments, one being your resume and another being a peer-reviewed article that you authored. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. Correct.
And then since the time of preparation of your written testimony, you and I talked, and I wanted to be make you completely aware that Summit now claims they have 57 ethanol plants participating in their proposed project, and that their total costs have gone up. Is that a fair statement?
I'm aware of that, yes.
Okay, and then in response to that, is it true that you prepared a new page to be a part of your pre-filed or part of your written testimony that essentially is a diagram depicting your findings based on that information?
Yes, I updated my previous results with the new numbers that I had available and provided them back to you.
All right, very good. Your Honor, I would offer at this time landowner exhibit 27, which is the direct written testimony, and then also landowner exhibit 50, which is the diagram Dr. Jacobson referenced.
50 being passed out? Okay.
Yes, Roseanne, please, I'm sorry.
All right, is there any objection to 27, landowner 27 or 50 on Mr. Dublinski?
There is, Your Honor, and with all due respect to Dr. Jacobson, we object to the testimony and the admission of the testimony and exhibits and to the witness as a whole for a couple of separate reasons, either of which I think would be sufficient. First of all, if you look at the pre-filed testimony, and we don't have to guess at what's going to be asked because the testimony is pre-filed, it is entirely about the comparative benefits of carbon sequestration from ethanol versus, in this particular case, conversion to battery electric vehicles and powering the grid that charges them from wind and solar. That sort of broad, general, it's a pretty high level argument, clearly could have, should have, and to some degree was argued in the 2023 hearing. None of that has anything to do with the issues that are specified in the reconsideration order. That is solely an argument about the project as a whole, which would have been appropriate a year ago, but not now. Second separate objection is strictly a relevance objection that this testimony, as I mentioned a moment ago, is a comparative argument between, if we take a pool of capital and invest it in carbon capture for ethanol versus if we invest it in battery electric vehicles, wind and solar, Dr. Jacobson argues that we would be better off in the second scenario where we invested differently. But that's not the issue that's in front of the board. The board is not choosing from a menu of different capital allocation options. It's looking at an application and judging it against the legal standards in the state of North Dakota. So for either of those reasons, this is inappropriate. We would object to any of this testimony or this witness coming in.
Mr. Pelham?
I agree with Mr. Dublinsky to a large extent, but at the same time, I am not going to join in the objection. I think that the commission can give whatever weight it decides to give as to this type of testimony in similar aspects as to the economic aspects. I know that that's not, it's apples and oranges, but we have gotten somewhat outside of some of the specific specified issues from the commission's order. But at the same time, I do believe the landowners, Mr. Jordy's clients, do have the ability to present their case as they believe that they should submit it. So with that said, I don't object, but I do have concerns.
All right. I am going to note the objection, but I will admit the exhibits, allow the testimony, and just advise the commission to weigh it, give it the weight it determines it should get, if any at all. So with that, Mr. Jordy, you can continue.
Yes, thank you. And Doctor, what just happened was maybe foreign to you. I'll just state as a preface to my next question that effects on the environment and impacts on the environment are present in all three factors the PSC considers, hence why I have you here. But we're not going to go through every line. That was the point of getting your testimony pulled together. I want to first just spend a minute or two on your CV so I don't gloss over that. So I establish you as an expert. Can you just give a very brief background of your CV education, what you do, and why your opinions should be considered?
Yes, thank you. I'm a professor of civil and environmental engineering at Stanford University, and I have been for the past 30 years, since 1994. Prior to that, I did my PhD in atmospheric sciences at UCLA. I did a master's degree there. I did a previous master's degree in environmental engineering at Stanford University. I did 2 undergraduate degrees, one in civil engineering, one in economics at Stanford University as well. And my expertise is not only looking at the impacts on the atmosphere of energy sources in terms of air pollution and climate impacts, but I also study energy systems and their impacts on the environment and ways to transition the energy system to minimize impacts and address large-scale environmental problems such as air pollution and global warming and energy security. So I can add more, but that's briefly.
That was a very, very brief description, but I think that satisfied what I needed to do there. If you could just summarize, your opinions, your kind of ultimate conclusions for the commission, please do that.
Well, ignoring even the comparison with wind, I mean, I've worked a lot on the impacts of ethanol on the environment, ethanol fuels and producing the fuels on the environment. And in particular, I've also, and so this goes back to 2007 when I published a paper on the impacts of transitioning the United States vehicle fleet to entirely ethanol-based E85 vehicles replacing gasoline vehicles and looking at the impacts on air pollution, health in particular, and finding that in about 3/4 of the United States, such a transition, just converting from gasoline to ethanol fueled vehicles run an E85 would increase air pollution death rates and also illnesses. The only locations where it would not was in the Southeast United States. And since then, I've done a lot of other work looking at the impacts on land use, water supply, air pollution, and climate of converting to an ethanol infrastructure. As you noted in my expert report, I did a paper recently on examining the Summit pipeline, the previous version of it, in which I looked at some of these impacts, but also compared to another scenario of investing the same amount of money in wind turbines powering battery electric vehicles. But the main conclusion, if I just were looking at the overall impact of building a carbon capture infrastructure with a pipeline infrastructure attached to these 57 ethanol refineries, the main impact is that you're going to saddle consumers into this infrastructure for decades. And this will mean, this will slow down a transition to cleaner renewable sources. Ethanol versus gasoline is almost the same amount of carbon equivalent emissions, no matter how you slice it. Some studies show slightly more, some studies show slightly less. Adding carbon capture to the fermentation process at ethanol refineries hardly puts a dent into that impact. So there's really no benefit on a large scale in terms of carbon emissions on adding these pipelines plus carbon capture equipment. But there's definitely an increase of air pollution, and there's an increase of costs of energy and fuel. And this is where this comparison with alternatives becomes important. When I did the comparison with wind powering electric vehicles, I found in the original study about 2.4 to 4 times the carbon dioxide equivalent emission savings, and about on the order of up to $60 billion plus over 30 years savings to consumers in fuel costs, primarily in fuel costs. I revised the numbers and they're summarized in this graph, and we still get, with the revised numbers, about 2.1 to 3.4 times the CO2 savings of going to battery electric vehicles powered by wind versus this carbon capture scheme. And a net savings of $48 to $84 billion in mostly fuel costs due to it. So in other words, a loss to consumers. So consumers are going to be saddled with high fuel costs, in other words, for decades to come with this scheme, and saddled with higher relative carbon equivalent emissions and air pollution. Air pollution emissions will continue. E85 vehicles, as I mentioned earlier, going back to our 2007 study, and we did several other studies looking at that issue. E85 vehicles will increase air pollution or keep it the same versus gasoline vehicles. That will keep the death rates similar from air pollution. Land use requirements, you'll require enormous amounts of land on the order of, in terms of compared with just building wind farms, even you need to grow corn for all this. I mean, photosynthesis is extremely inefficient for producing energy. Only 1% of energy from the sun gets converted to energy in a biofuel crop, whereas solar panels are 20% efficient. In other words, 20% of the energy in the sun gets converted to electricity. So if you put solar panels on a piece of land, you're getting 20 times more energy compared with growing a biofuel crop. And on top of that, electric vehicles use 1/4 the energy as internal combustion engine vehicles, such as flex fuel vehicles. So if you use solar, or you can use wind, but let's say solar to power battery electric vehicles, you're using 1/80th the land area as growing a biofuel crop to power a flex fuel vehicle. So you're not only using humongous amounts of land, and a good portion of that land requires water. About 13% of all corn in the United States is irrigated. And so that would, if you're growing all that corn and irrigating a big portion of it for energy, takes up a big portion of the water supply. you're taking water, you're taking land, you're increasing or keeping the same air pollution, and you're hardly putting a dent in carbon versus, and you're basically making it more difficult to transition to something that's much cleaner in terms of air pollution, much more reduction of carbon, much less land use, much less water consumption. So to me, it's if you're really looking at the big picture, you really need to look at all the possibilities of what to do and not just say, oh, well, this might benefit certain people and approve it, because it's going to saddle consumers, especially with high fuel costs for decades to come.
So in this, throughout this process and recently, and Mr. Powell, who you may or may not know, 2024 testimony, Summit claims that the project, not just the pipeline, I guess, but the whole project will play an important role in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Is your testimony, I mean, is that like technically true if we just look at that statement, but what you're broadening it out to what are the big net effects as opposed to just that one sentence?
Yeah, well, even if you look at the greenhouse gas emissions that are argued to be reduced, well, I mean, I calculate based on the new data, because based on the new data, you not only have the emissions reductions associated with adding carbon capture, but you have to then add in emissions that are added back to the air due to the energy required to compress the CO2 and to run it through the pipeline, to build the whole pipeline system, and the fact that there's going to be downtime for these carbon capture equipment. So the 18 million metric tons per year CO2 that the pipeline could hold, that's a maximum. That's not the actual amount that will go through the pipeline. But I could calculate based on, well, starting based on the previous numbers and then just scaling it up based on the new number of refineries, and then accounting for the reduction of CO2 savings due to the energy required to compress the CO2, run it through the pipeline, and also to build the pipeline system. It's about 13.8 million metric tons per year. That's what could allegedly be reduced due to the system, but that's on the equivalent of less than 0.2% of US greenhouse gas CO2 emissions alone, just from fossil fuel sources, not even counting all the other CO2 emission sources. I mean, but doing the wind projects instead, you're going to get, instead of 0.2, you're getting closer to 0.8, or somewhere between 0.5 and 1% of US CO2 emission reductions. So it's even in the best case of that CO2, you're still going to put it's a small dent in the CO2 emissions, but you're not even, that's just what's avoided, but there's still a huge amount of CO2 emissions associated with this ethanol production process, because there's CO2 associated with the growing of the crops, cultivating the crops, fertilizing them, energy going to watering them, transporting, and you can't transport ethanol by pipeline. You have to train, truck, or barge it around. And this is one of the reasons why the CO2 emissions from ethanol is higher, especially the upstream portion, than gasoline in some cases, is because of this fact that you can put you can put oil through pipelines, but you can't put ethanol in pipelines. And so you end up putting not only greenhouse gas emissions, but black carbon, which is the main component of soot, the second leading cause of global warming, that comes from diesel exhaust. Trains, trucks, and barges all use diesel exhaust or diesel fuel, and as a result emit diesel, which is the second leading cause of global warming, which is not even accounted for in any of these analyses. So you have all these emissions that are, and plus you have the combustion emissions of the ethanol vehicles. Electric vehicles have zero emissions from the tailpipe. You have similar emissions from the tailpipe from ethanol vehicles as gasoline vehicles. And so when you go to electric vehicles, you reduce so much more carbon dioxide, but you reduce air pollution. You reduce all the air pollution from the tailpipe of the vehicles. So it is really important to compare other technologies. In fact, not comparing with other options in such an infrastructure project that will last for decades is, I think, really going to potentially damage the people of North Dakota as well as the other states involved here.
So to kind of sum up then, is it your opinion that approving this project, based on your education, experience, background, expertise, training, will not produce just minimal adverse effects on the environment?
Oh, no, this is a major, I mean, there's 2,500 miles of pipelines. And so you're going to be invading people's lands and digging up their soil, causing all sorts of soil displacement and it'll damage habitat, some habitats in some cases, maybe inadvertently. But the main impact that I look at is the impact on air pollution and climate. And this will have virtually zero benefit for climate. And it'll be, as I mentioned, though, it's going to, when you put up an infrastructure, it's really encouraging people and really going to make a lot of people who buy flex fuel vehicles, then they'll hold on to them for 15, 20 years. And this will make it difficult to transition to something that actually is solving the problem, is helping to solve the problem. So as an opportunity cost, it's an enormous opportunity cost. But as an actual cost, the air pollution is going to be enormous. It's already enormous from ethanol refineries. It's already enormous from gasoline vehicles or flex fuel vehicles, and from in terms of the air pollutants that come out, like aldehydes, acetaldehyde in particular, formaldehyde, low molecular weight organics. It's very well known that flex fuel vehicles, compared with gasoline, they emit more organic gases, lower oxides of nitrogen, similar amounts of, more acetaldehyde and formaldehyde, which are both carcinogens, less toluene, less butadiene and benzene, which are also carcinogens. So the carcinogens equal out, but the higher organics, the lower NOx, both contribute to more ozone. And this is why the ethanol fueled vehicles cause similar air pollution or more air pollution, depending on where you are, than gasoline. But it's going to cause tremendous damage compared with alternatives, but also given the short time we have to address climate and address air pollution health problems worldwide. And just put in perspective, air pollution is the second leading cause of death worldwide. 7.5 million people die from air pollution. Hundreds of millions more become ill. In the United States, it's about 100,000 people die each year from air pollution. And the global warming is such a large problem right now. We're reaching the record temperatures everywhere on the earth. We have 6 years to solve 80% of the problem. And when we propose solutions that, first of all, this won't even be implemented for several years to build this whole infrastructure. And during that time, all emissions will continue. And then we're just going to continue emissions for years to come, as opposed to starting right away to transition to clean, renewable energy that eliminates air pollution emissions and climate relevant emissions. That is going to really slow down the solution to climate change and air pollution problems. And it'll also devastate the landscape. I mean, you don't need 2,500 miles of pipelines to use battery electric vehicles.
Sir, your testimony is very detailed, as are the scholarly articles that you've provided. And like I promised, I'm not going to go through all of those. So I appreciate your testimony. I'm going to turn you over to others who may have questions for you. Thank you.
Sure.
Mr. Dublinsky?
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Dr. Jacobson.
Good afternoon.
And this may sound familiar from the motion we were arguing over earlier, but well, actually, let me start with one question. Your actual testimony is pretty brief, and part of it is summarizing your article. I gather that the main point of the testimony is to introduce and provide what lawyers call foundation for the attached article that you wrote. Fair?
You mean in the testimony, you mean all the preamble to the testimony is foundation?
Well, the 4 or 5 pages of testimony, part of which introduces you, part of which introduces the paper. My point is that there's not a lot in that. What that really does is just presents to the commission the paper you wrote, correct?
Yeah, most of it's focused on the results of the paper, I'd say.
And I understand that any summary inherently will lose a lot of subtlety and nuance, but let me give it a shot and you can tell me if I do okay. On page 4 of that testimony, you summarize your paper. And is it fair to say that your summary is that comparatively speaking, it would result in lower costs for drivers and lower carbon emissions if rather than capturing carbon from ethanol, everyone switched to battery electric vehicles, and second, that those vehicles were charged from a grid that's powered by wind and solar?
That's a conclusion, yeah. The specific study looked at taking the same amount of money, I think at the time it was $5.6 billion, and using that money to purchase wind farms to then run battery electric vehicles, which individuals would purchase. And then there's a difference in the purchase price of the electric version versus the gasoline version. It was like more expensive for the electric version by about $21,000 per vehicle. But yeah, the conclusion is correct that it would be because of the enormous fuel cost savings primarily, the consumers would save a huge amount of money. And because of the larger carbon emissions reductions, you're going to get, I think in that case, 2.4 to 4 times the CO2 emission reduction compared with the ethanol plan in the paper that was published.
Fair to say that in your view, based on that result, that you believe the public should switch to battery electric vehicles and the grid should switch to wind and solar immediately?
As fast as possible, yes. So decisions going forward should be focused on electrifying transportation, and providing electricity as much as possible with clean renewable energy. I know it can't be done overnight, but every decision going forward should have that focus, I would say.
So I want to ask about that. You say every decision going forward. So in your view, government should use its decision-making power to force people off of the use of fossil fuels. Fair?
Well, I didn't say government had to do this. I mean, I think government helps to do this. I think
that's the question we're here for, right? Is for a government decision.
Yeah, well, I think it's all levels of society. So individuals, well, I'm providing what I think will give us the best result and consumers the best result. So the best way to do that, yeah, I have my own opinion, but that's I guess up to, each state.
And I noted that in your paper, one of the vehicles that you used to set that up was a F-150 Lightning. Your position that all the farmers and ranchers in North Dakota should switch to battery powered trucks as soon as they can.
Yeah, I mean, I will say it's to their benefit to do that from a cost point of view, from a health point of view, climate point of view, and a land use point of view, and a water supply and point of view. So there are many other options besides the Lightning F-150 for electric trucks now. But yeah, that was one option.
You're aware that North Dakota has the 3rd fewest charging stations in the country?
That can change as well. And, I had an electric car in 2009. There were virtually no charging stations anywhere, yet I managed to drive hundreds of miles on trips and found places to charge. Not saying that's how everybody should live, but I'm saying the charging stations are growing rapidly. There are, I can look at a map. I bet I'll find thousands of charging stations in North Dakota. If I looked at a map right now, there are a lot more than people usually think, but I don't know the number. I'm just guessing that there are probably lots.
Would you have reason to question if I said that you can knock a 0 off that it's closer to 100 than to 1,000?
I mean, if you have the data, like I was surprised there's, I don't know if that includes people's individual homes where people have their own chargers in their home. I mean, usually when you get a car, you usually put a charger in your own home. So the 90% of travel, 95% of travel is within 30 miles of homes. And these cars, electric trucks now have range of several hundred miles. So, when you buy an electric truck, you usually would put it, and if you have a home, that is, not everybody has homes, a lot of people have apartments, so that's more of an issue for people with apartment complexes. But if you do have your own home. Sorry.
Switch over from the transportation side of the equation to the grid side of the equation. Obviously, your paper calls for charging those vehicles off of a grid that is wind and solar powered in its entirety. Have you been involved in the siting permit process for any wind or solar?
No, not personally, but.
Are you? There's been plenty of coverage of it. I assume you're aware that there is a significant percentage of counties in the United States that have moratoria against new wind and solar development, and that number is growing.
Well, okay, South Dakota last year, 96% of all the electricity it consumed was produced by wind and hydropower. So, and North Dakota is, I think, ranked like number maybe 11 in the states with the highest percentage of their electricity generated from wind, water, and solar, with primarily a lot of wind. So I don't think there are moratoriums certainly, but this isn't stopping the growth of in the Midwest in particular for wind, in particular, but also solar, because I mean, Montana and Iowa are both at 80% wind, water, solar in their generation of electricity relative to their consumption. Nebraska, Oklahoma, Kansas are also, and Idaho as well, are also in the top 10 or so states in terms of percentage. There's really, we're much further along than most people realize in many states in the United States. There are a lot of states that aren't very far along, but they're not in the Midwest where you have so much wind.
Your paper calls for a rapid decarbonization of the electric grid. Does that paper include any assessment of what economic impact that would have on North Dakota specifically if we moved away from oil and gas?
Yeah, in fact, I've got some statistics I can draw up if you just want to give me 1 second.
Dr. Jacobson, that was not my question. My question was, did the paper you submitted include an economic analysis for North Dakota of the economic impacts of moving away from oil and gas?
Well, the paper I submitted was focused on this, the comparison of the ethanol pipeline system and with wind versus and solar. So I didn't look at what's the cost of keeping the entire grid stable, but I do have some statistics on that from other sources if you're interested, but I didn't discuss that in that paper.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Mr. Pelham, any questions?
Thank you. Good afternoon, Professor. I'm just wondering if you have an opinion on the future from your perspective of the ethanol industry.
Well, I know there's a big push from the agricultural consortium to increase ethanol use. So from a purely business point of view, I can see how that has gained traction because there are obviously a lot of farmers in the Midwest and corn farmers in particular, and corn is used for ethanol, and that's a potential use of fuel. So if you're just looking at it from the point of view of farmers and ethanol producers, there's a lot of money to be made. But if you're looking at it from a point of view of consumers, it's really expensive to use ethanol as a transportation fuel, and it's getting more expensive. And there are much cheaper alternatives that are also much healthier for the citizens of these states and better for the climate, and also will provide energy security for decades to come. So what actually happens is a question of politics. What I think should happen if we're looking at it from a social cost point of view, and a social cost point of view is one that looks at health costs and climate costs and energy costs together, as opposed to a business perspective, which looks only at the business costs. From the social cost point of view, it's far beneficial to move away from any type of combustion fuel, whether it's gasoline or diesel or ethanol. So what actually happens will depend a lot on lobbying, as we see, because, I mean, even in the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, 40% of the technology, the funding, the subsidies that are proposed are going towards technologies that are not necessarily helpful at all, like carbon capture, blue hydrogen, direct air capture, small modular nuclear reactors, and a lot of bioenergy. But there are lobbies that push for these, and that's how they get into them. So that's the issue. Whether it happens or not, I can't say. Whether it should happen from a scientific point of view, it's definitely not helpful.
You mentioned carbon capture storage. What's your view, if any, on the future of carbon capture storage in North Dakota?
Well, first of all, there's no financial benefit of putting carbon under the ground. I mean, that's probably the best thing to do with it, but there's no benefit. So there's 73% of all carbon capture projects worldwide to date are the carbon dioxide that's captured has been used for enhanced oil recovery and not sequestered under the ground. Only a small portion of the carbon dioxide has been put under the ground. So I'm just kind of surprised to see that this was their proposal. Not that it's not, I mean, I'd rather see it go into the ground than be used for enhanced oil recovery, because enhanced oil recovery, about 40% of the CO2 that's captured goes right back to the air immediately. And then you're digging up more oil, because that's the purpose of enhanced oil recovery, is to make oil less dense by bonding carbon dioxide to it. So more of it can come out faster. And then you burn more oil, so that defeats the purpose of trying to sequester carbon. But my understanding also was, even though this was promised to be for sequestration, there was something I read about, and I don't know if it turned out to be a false story or not, that the Summit changed their mind and now is using it, and now considering it for enhanced oil recovery. But if it's going to be used for sequestration, the problem is always that any kind of carbon capture always increases carbon dioxide, and you can prove this. Carbon capture and direct air capture always increase CO2. The reason is, even if in the best case, let's say you're using, because there's an energy penalty. Well, let me just say on any type of synthetic carbon capture. Trees are great. So trees can take out carbon dioxide from the air, sequester it in the wood, but they don't require energy and they don't require equipment. Carbon capture requires energy and equipment. And even in the best case of using renewable energy, when you use renewable energy for that carbon capture, you're preventing that renewable energy from replacing a fossil source directly. And replacing a fossil source with renewable energy removes more carbon dioxide than running carbon capture equipment with renewable energy. So it's always an opportunity cost to use carbon capture equipment. And it's, in other words, you're always going to be increasing CO2 relative to using that renewable energy for a better purpose.
Professor,
And
forgive me for being a bit slow here, though, but as I understand the proposed project here that the line is being proposed to be cited for is the removal of CO2 from the ethanol producing process so that it can be sequestered. So I don't understand or follow you, sir, forgive me, as to how that would create more CO2 in the process.
well, there's two ways. It depends, because in this case, you are using energy. Now, this case of taking the CO2 from the fermentation process, it's a pure stream than, let's say, taking the CO2 from a coal plant. So it doesn't require as much energy to extract that CO2. You do still need energy to compress the CO2 and run it through the pipe. And in that case, that energy is additional energy requirement that would not otherwise be used. And so normally let's say that in the best case, let's say you were using wind energy to run that, provide that electricity to pressurize the CO2. Well, you could have taken that wind energy and replaced a coal source, and you would have reduced more CO2. That's the point I'm trying to make. It's always an opportunity cost. It's always a trade-off, no matter what you're doing. It's important to look at the alternatives of what you could be doing better. And in this case, that's what I did. In this case, the bigger opportunity cost is not so much the energy used for the compression, it's the fact that you're using the ethanol at all. Why are you using the ethanol? Almost all the use of the ethanol is to run transportation vehicles. And the point is that's an opportunity cost in itself. You would reduce a lot more CO2 by going to electric vehicles powered by renewable sources, and by focusing on putting money into these ethanol refineries and keeping them alive, that's saddling consumers for decades with high fuel costs and higher CO2 emissions. So there's definitely going to be an increase of CO2 emissions compared with taking that same amount of money and investing in a clean renewable energy infrastructure with electric vehicles.
Thank you, sir. I don't have any other questions for you.
Mr. Bakke, any questions?
No questions, Your Honor.
Commissioner Chrisman?
Okay, sir, I'm no engineer like you, so I don't want the total engineering long explanation. Can you give me kind of a simple Rancher Randy kind of an explanation? I've noticed this, it never happens, but why can't we ship ethanol in a pipeline?
Because it corrodes. Ethanol is corrosive and it'll corrode the pipeline pretty quickly. So
just too expensive to line them or something with a non-corrosive?
That part, well, it's just not been done. So it must be either too expensive or it doesn't actually work very well for the length of pipelines. So yeah, I don't know I'm not a pipeline expert to say, so to speak. I just know that it's corrosive and that's, it's never been done.
Did I get your number right? You said 96% of the electricity consumed in South Dakota last year was from wind and solar?
No, wind and hydro. So in fact, I'll give you the exact numbers. There's actually hardly any solar in South Dakota, but yeah, in South Dakota, 96.52% of the electricity consumed was produced from wind, 69.7% wind, 26.5% hydro, about 0.35% utility PV, and about 0.03% rooftop PV. That adds up to 96.5% of the total consumption. In North Dakota, it's 56.3%.
So
5% hydro, 51.3% wind.
Does that mean that that's what percent of their electricity came from those sources, or that those sources produced an amount of electricity equivalent to that percentage of the power that they used?
I think the latter. So of the amount that was consumed, not the amount that was produced, but the amount that was consumed, in South Dakota, 69.7% of the amount consumed, the equivalent of 69.7% was produced by wind. The equivalent of 26.5% was produced by hydro.
Would you argue my point that there's a hell of a lot of the time that they're producing that energy that you're counting as being consumed by them, but they're exporting it because they're overproducing for what they need at that moment in time?
Oh, yes, for sure.
There'd be a lot of hours, let me finish, there'd be a lot of hours out of the year where they'd be sitting in dark, cold houses if they didn't have things other than renewables far more than 4% of the time.
Well, I agree with part of your statement, but not the dire part. Yes, they're also, other generators include coal and gas and fossil fuels. So they're producing more than they consume, over 100%. If my point is though, you could replace those with batteries and more solar, or solar plus more wind. And also South Dakota is connected to a grid. So even if the state itself doesn't have enough electricity at a given moment, it's connected to the whole Western grid. There are 7 countries in the world that are 100% renewables in the annual average, and including an island, Iceland, which is 100% renewables, all geothermal, wind and hydro, mostly geothermal, mostly hydro and geothermal, some wind. But in California, actually, for the last 55 days has been over 100% renewables for up to 10 hours a day. And on average has been around 80%, close to 80% renewables on the grid. And this is an increase of, like, compared with last year, up 12 to 15%. And in fact, during the night, up to about 12% of all the electricity at night is produced by batteries in California right now. So,
two of your comments there led me to subsequent questions. You talked about California. Do you live in Stanford, Fremont area, somewhere there?
Yes, in the Stanford area, yeah.
So how often do you have to go out and take long trips in sub-zero weather with your battery car?
I don't, but I mean, in Norway they do. And I think around 90% of all cars sold last year were battery electric cars in Norway. Same in Sweden and Finland. There are a lot of battery electric cars in Iceland as well. So,
Isn't it you Californians that started the big subsidies for carbon captured ethanol that led to these ethanol plants wanting to do this in the first place?
it's possible. I wouldn't put it past our state to do that.
Possible, but it's true, correct?
I mean, I don't know, so, but I'll defer to you on that one. But it's possible from my point of view, yes.
And then in the earlier answer, you talked about, well, South Dakota could, have more batteries so that they would have power when those renewables aren't working. And you also have talked a lot about wind and especially on the solar side of it. You're familiar with the large volume of critical elements and rare earth minerals that it takes to produce those batteries and solar panels, correct?
Oh, yes. But
and when you were talking about land use impacts, tell me how the land use impacts in places like Congo and China are from producing those things for us.
Very trivial in comparison with replacing with the fossil fuels that they're replacing. I mean, for a
very trivial. Okay,
trivial,
I'm sorry.
yes.
So the land use impacts are very trivial. What about the human impacts in coming up with your study? And I'm sorry, I did not get time to read your study in advance, but I'm really looking forward to it. Did you interview any Uyghur slaves in China or any prepubescent miners in Congo about how it is to produce those things for United States of America at affordable prices?
Maybe if we can address one issue at a time, like you talk about the land requirements. So can I get to that first, and then I'll get to the Congo? In the United States, 1.3% of all U.S. land area is occupied by the fossil fuel industry. In North America, there are 50,000 new oil and gas wells drilled every year, and this is for fuel, to provide fuel mostly gas, but also oil. And if you transition the United States to 100% renewables for all purposes, that's electricity, transportation, buildings, and industry, we calculate less than 1% of the land would be occupied. So that would be a reduction of land use compared with a fossil fuel industry. But the difference is with the fossil fuel industry, you need 50,000 new oil and gas wells every year forever. Whereas you transition to a renewable energy infrastructure, then the growth of the land footprint will only increase slowly because we eliminate the need for continuous fuel. With fossil fuels, you need continuous fuel to fill up your gas tank, to provide gas for your home. And so you need to mine continuously. You eliminate that need to mine continuously. So the amount of mining that's required for fossil fuels is orders of magnitude larger than for a wind, water, solar system that includes batteries. Because the batteries you produce them once every 15, 20 years. I mean, I have a battery from 2009 car and it's the same battery system. So it's been 15 years. It's only degraded about 20%. But the batteries today are much better. Some are warranted for 15,000 cycles. That's like 40 years. And they also recycle. Batteries are now recycled. Redwood Materials is a company that recycles 97% of their battery components. Sonnen is a battery company that recycle 100% of their battery components. So the lithium is recycled and most of the materials. The Congo, you're talking about cobalt mostly, and there are batteries now that have no cobalt in them, LFP batteries, for example. So there are alternatives if that's the major concern. But again, compare the land use requirements for, let's say, mining batteries is again trivial to the land use required to mine fossil fuels. It's 2 orders of magnitude less because you need fossil fuels. You have to mine them continuously. There are over 6 to 900,000, I think it was 900,000 wells in Pennsylvania alone. Mostly fracking wells for gas. So we're talking apples and oranges. There's small numbers comparison for batteries and other clean renewable energy infrastructure compared to fossil fuel infrastructure. Sure, there are. Sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, why don't you ask? You can either repeat a question or ask.
Did you say 1.3% of America in mining activity?
Not at 1.3% for, well, a combination of the 3.2 million abandoned oil and gas wells and the 1.2 million active oil and gas wells. There are millions of miles of pipelines. There's storage facilities. There's refineries. There's hundreds of thousands of gas stations. There's coal mines. So we're talking about the whole fossil fuel infrastructure.
I want to emphasize coal mines in particular. I've been close to your area. I've been in San Francisco, and pray that I never have to go back. Have you ever been up here? I'm from 70 miles northwest of Bismarck in the heart of coal country.
I mean, I was in Montana a few weeks ago, which is near too far. I don't know if I've been in North Dakota.
I'd like to invite you to come and visit it sometime and see the way we reclaim the coal mine land.
Yeah, it's a beautiful state from what I've seen of it. There is a lot of mining going on, though, of gas wells. You can fly over it. I have flown over it. And you can look down and you can see all these pockmarks of wells everywhere, thousands of them.
And then they get reclaimed. It's a beautiful thing. When you fly over, were those battery-powered planes you flew over in? Because as I understand, a lot of the need for this that we've heard in previous hearings is for plant-based jet fuel. And I have yet to see a large commercial airliner run on batteries.
Well, jet fuel is not going to help climate or air pollution. Sorry, replacing jet fuel with what they call sustainable aviation fuel, which is from ethanol, is definitely not going to make a dent at all in climate or air pollution problems. So just as a pure substitute, if you're not interested, if the issue is not climate or air pollution or those other environmental issues, then yeah, sure, you can use all sorts of combustion fuels. But
my last line
it depends what your priority is.
Then my last line here is, have you listened to our hearings? This current round, we started Thursday and continued yesterday and today. Have you listened to the hearings? Or
just for about 20 minutes before I came on.
Okay. We've had other witnesses, and I'm not 100% sure, but I think some of them may have been Mr. Jordy's clients that talked about the need for more CO2 in the atmosphere because it improves their crops and the grazing for their cattle. And you seem to be very anti-CO2, so can you bring those two concepts together? Or maybe you don't like cattle either, I don't know.
No, I mean, CO2 there's natural CO2 in the background atmosphere, but increasing CO2, we do not need increased CO2 compared. I mean, the crops grow well with current CO2. Whether they grow slightly better with even more CO2, you can argue that, but you have to contrast that with the much greater damage from higher temperatures. I mean, last year, the globally average temperature was almost 1.5 degrees higher, is 1.48, I think, in the global average. Higher than from the 1850 to 1900 period. And that is way faster growth rate of temperatures. And the damage due to that, all these wildfires, you have to look at the enhanced wildfire damage, the enhanced flooding, enhanced droughts, more intense hurricanes, more intense storms, the famine that occurs in many parts of the world, all the impacts of climate change, which are estimated to be about $30 trillion per year by 2050, are going to far outpace any of this small amount of, growing grass, the slight increased growth rate of grass So again, it's a comparing like something trivial with something like enormous. So it's, I mean, the argument, the CO2 argument that CO2 is beneficial, and that's why we should allow CO2. That's an argument maintained by what are called climate deniers or climate contrarians usually. So it's the credibility usually goes away when people start using that argument.
Okay, well, I have no more questions, but as a lifelong North Dakotan, I just want to leave you with an invitation while the students are home for the summer to come up North Dakota. It's as green and beautiful with the current climate as I've ever seen it. We just came off of a beautiful winter. It's lovely up here. Come out and visit our Badlands and our beautiful prairies.
Yeah, no, it is a beautiful state. I love it as far as I've seen it from photographs and pictures.
Commissioner Haugen-Hoffert.
Dr. Jacobson, thank you for your testimony. I'm not going to ask you any questions for the sake of time because I know we have a lot of other witnesses to go through. I'm just going to thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Mr. Dawson, any questions?
No questions.
Mr. Jordy, any redirect?
Yes, thank you. So you gave some detailed testimony that if we're looking from the point of consumers, which of course would fall under the welfare of the citizens of North Dakota, that approving this project would ultimately have negative effects. Is that correct?
Yes. And I mean, driving an electric car, you use 1/4 the energy as driving a combustion car. And you spend on average 1/4 as much for fuel. And this is like and you will recognize this right away. Like if you're spending $100 a week on fuel, you would end up spending $25 a week on fuel. And probably even less as prices go up for combustion fuels. I mean, I've been fortunate to have my own home with solar. I have an electric car, and I have not paid a gasoline bill since 2017. I haven't paid and I've produced all my own electricity in the annual average, including for my own whole home. And I will say that just electric cars are extremely efficient. They're amazing in terms of their efficiency. And I think once somebody drives them, they never want to go back. So I would just hope people are like looking, not looking at new technologies and saying, we have to stick to the old technologies. This is something that's really good. And I try to practice what I preach. And I will say that the electric cars are efficient and clean, and they have hardly any repairs, and they're resilient. So I would, in this case, by kind of pushing people to go towards more combustion for the next 30 years, that's going to set people back in terms of their pocketbooks for decades to come.
And then Commissioner Crispin asked you if you were aware that some people have testified that their position is that they don't want to sequester CO2, or they're skeptical because they think it's a benefit. And I don't care if you agree or disagree, but you understand that the conclusion of those people is we don't need a pipeline because they believe, whether rightly or wrongly, we don't need to be sequestering CO2. Do you at least understand that point?
Yes, that makes sense. I mean, the best way to sequester CO2 is not to emit it in the first place. And so spending $1 to stop emissions somewhere is better than trying to capture the emissions. And so this is why we want to, focus on not emitting from combustion vehicles in the first place.
And so, regardless of what anyone thinks about that line of thought process, they say we don't need the pipeline. And then your expert opinion says if we actually care about impacts and environmental preservation and the things that PSC is charged with relative to these greenhouse gases, you also say that a 2,500 mile CO2 pipeline is not the answer, yes?
Correct. I mean, you're just adding infrastructure and it's hardly having any benefit. It has a huge cost associated with it.
All right. So either way, West Coast, East Coast, North Dakota, those testimonies all get to the same point. We don't need the pipeline, correct?
That's my opinion.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Professor. I appreciate the time, and I don't have anything further.
Thank you.
Mr. Dubilinski, any additional questions? Mr. Pelham?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. Bakke?
No, Your Honor.
Any other commissioner questions, or Mr. Dawson?
Your Honor, I don't know when the appropriate time to ask this is, but could we have a late filed exhibit from Mr. Jordy? I'd like to see the source of the information showing that 96% or more of the electricity consumed in South Dakota is produced by wind, solar, or hydro.
Yeah,
Did you
I
catch
got
that,
a link
Mr.
for
Jordy?
that.
Yep, we'll get that link right over to you. Too sweet.
Okay.
You can
All right,
just send it to me, Professor. I'll get it.
Yeah, I'll send it to you.
You bet.
All right, thank you, Dr. Jacobson.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Jordy, you have one additional witness you wanted to call this afternoon?
Yep, I've got Dr. Ted Shetler, who's on board. I didn't know if you want to take a quick break. I'm not going to take a whole hour with him, so I suspect we're going to be.
You think we can get through him in an hour, give or take a little?
My plan is to be done by, not my questioning, his entire presentation to be done by 5, all questioning.
Okay. Would we like a short break? 5 minutes? Let's do a 5-minute break, quick restroom break, and then we will proceed with the last witness for the day. Mr. Jordy, do we have you? Mr. Jordy, can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, I can. For some reason, I couldn't unmute, Your Honor, but I can hear you.
Great. And has your next witness joined?
There he is, Dr. Ted. Yep.
There he is. He wasn't
Hello.
there when I said it, just so you know.
All right.
All right, we're gonna get started. Mr. Jordy, I'll let you formally call your next witness.
Yes, thank you. Landowners call Dr. Ted Shetler.
Dr. Shetler, I'll have you state your full name for the record and please spell your last name.
My name is Ted Shetler, Schettler.
And Dr. Shetler, before you testify this afternoon, I'm required by law to advise you on the penalties of perjury in the state of North Dakota. Perjury is a Class C felony, punishable by a maximum fine of $10,000, a maximum 5 years imprisonment, or both. Do you understand what perjury is?
I do.
And being advised of the potential penalties for perjury, do you promise to tell the truth in this case today?
I do, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Jordy.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Shetler. Did you cause to be prepared what we've been calling direct or pre-filed written testimony, approximately 13 pages to be utilized in this matter?
I did.
And Doctor, that testimony also lays foundation for and summarizes some attachments that you've included. One is a bio, kind of a CV on yourself, and a second is a scientific article that you authored in 2022. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's a scientific article. I did author that. It was not published in a scientific journal, but I put that together from a variety of published peer-reviewed sources. Yes.
Understood. So essentially a summary of peer-reviewed information, correct?
That's correct. That's correct.
All right. And so that we don't have you on the witness stand here all day, sir, what I'm going to do, I'm going to offer your testimony here, and we'll see if there's any objections, and then I'm going to ask you a handful of questions about it, okay?
That's fine.
All right. I will offer landowner exhibit 26.
Any objection, Mr. Dublinski?
Yes, Your Honor. First of all, the same objections as last time, that this is a topic to the general toxicology with respect to various concentrations of CO2 that is not unique to the reconsideration case. It is strictly material that could have, should have, and certainly was discussed a year ago. And I think, Your Honor, with all due respect, both yesterday and last Friday did sustain several objections on that basis. I understand that we just had, obviously, Dr. Jacobson. His material was at least somewhat unique, but the toxicology of CO2 is something that's been discussed previously in this case. In addition, with respect to this particular subject matter, the only thing it's relevant to is safety, which I think clearly is an area that has been repeatedly ruled to be outside of the board's or the commission's jurisdiction. So for those reasons, we would object to the admission of the testimony and object to the witness.
Mr. Pelham, any position on the pre-filed testimony and the testimony of Dr. Shetler?
Would agree and join in the objection. As to the scope, I think that this is testimony and evidence that could have been and certainly was to a large degree previously covered in prior hearings by the commission. There is, I would not join in the objection as to the safety aspect. While The commission does not have primacy over safety. PHMSA does, but there are elements of safety that the commission does have some jurisdiction over. So I would not join in that part of the objection. Thank you.
Which part are you joining in?
Joining in the scope and the fact that this testimony that's being offered has been covered in prior hearings, and landowners, interveners had the opportunity to present evidence on the scope of this at prior hearings. And since the reconsideration motion was granted, it's essentially outside of the scope.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Jordy, your intent is to offer the pre-filed testimony and to ask very limited questions this afternoon?
Well, first I'm going to offer the pre-filed testimony, and then I have some questions for him relative to another study that's out there.
And do we have that study? Or is that something you're offering?
No, I mean, no, I'm not offering it as an exhibit. I'm just going to ask him some questions.
Your Honor, for purposes of having a record on behalf of Burleigh County, is it okay if I state a position in relation to
Go ahead.
request? I believe this witness should be allowed to testify, and it's my understanding that on the scope issue, part of the scope of this proceeding is issues 1 and 3 identified by the PSC, the first one being whether or not the Summit pipeline construction and operation and maintenance will produce minimal adverse effects on the welfare of the citizens. And certainly the impact of CO2 on individuals' health is clearly relevant to that issue that is being heard in these hearings now. And then in relation to issue number 3, his testimony would also be relevant to the issue of whether the construction, operation, and maintenance produces minimal adverse human impacts, once again, directly relevant to what I understand his pre-filed testimony and testimony here today relates to. So I just wanted that to be on the record as to Burleigh County's position.
I obviously don't set the scope of, I did not dictate or set the scope of the purpose for these hearings. That is determined by the PSC. So I'm inclined to follow what Mr. Pelham has set forth on behalf of the commission. I think it's hard to parse out the pre-filed testimonies, so I'm going to admit the pre-filed testimony, note the objections. And again, I said this numerous times, we've covering a lot of the same ground, so let's not spend a lot of time on ground that's already been presented or topics or items that have already been presented by other witnesses or last year during our set of hearings.
Your Honor, just for clarification, because this will come up again and again and again. I read the August 2023 order that the commission has made a finding with regard to the adequacy of the information in front of it on human health and safety and animal health and safety. But even if Mr. Baki's right about the first criteria about impacts, I understand the scope of this hearing to be, yes, those impacts. As to those changes or new items in the reroute and other adjustments that have been made by Summit in the reconsideration filing, not to reopen the entire case, and that impacts broadly are still a live issue for everything. And this will come up obviously with several of the remaining witnesses. So I would just be, if you're willing to give a clarification on that ruling, I think it would be helpful.
Well, Your Honor, I've got to jump in here. So all of this testimony and any testimony you're going to hear is relevant to the reroute. If they rerouted 1 inch, that 1 inch is now potentially affecting new people and has different considerations and needs to be discussed. So all of this testimony is relevant to the potential routing of a hazardous CO2 pipeline on the Bismarck reroute and the alleged 100 other changes they've made across the state.
It is not unique to that, and the general material could and should have been presented in the 2023 hearing.
But there's no order that says that. There's no restriction. There's no law. There's no rule that states that. I realize that's Summit's wish, but that's not the law. It's not the rule.
Mr. Pelham, any clarification you would like to put on the record?
I don't disagree with Mr. Jordy as to the reroute nature, but there is the cumulative nature of testimony that has been presented. And I think that there at some point does need to be a limitation as to that, because it just gets to be repetitive and is not conducive to efficiency and efficient use of the commission's time. Certainly, there is an understanding as to the hazardous nature of this pipeline. We've spent a lot of time on that at this hearing today, as well as at many prior hearings. So I think my objection really stands on that there needs to be some limitation as to the repetitiveness that has been already been provided in terms of evidence and testimony at numerous hearings at prior times, including prior to the reconsideration order.
Mr. Dublinsky, the clarification I can give you is what was published by the commission in its notice of hearing, which did include those 3 broad issues. I understood that to be within the scope of the revised route, but again, we're somewhat circling back to these same issues. So I concur. I have similar concerns with Mr. Pelham that we're accumulating evidence that's already been provided. So I guess we have to proceed the way we can. And I would just direct Mr. Jordy and Mr. Bakke that we don't want to hear the same information over and over again. So you both have been at all the hearings, so you know what's been presented. And so at this point, I think new information or evidence that it hasn't previously been provided or testified to or contained in an exhibit is what we're looking to be presented at this hearing.
Yep, and one of the problems is the secret information that the PSC only has. We have no idea what claims are made in there as to toxicity and effect, and we are at a disadvantage and therefore need to put on evidence because we're just guessing what claims Summit has made to the PSC privately. So is that exhibit admitted 26, Your Honor?
Yes, I did admit it. I have noted the objections, and with multiple of these other exhibits, I would allow the commission to give it what weight it deems it should have. So go ahead, Mr. Jordy.
Thank you very much. Doctor, I don't want to belabor this, so I'm going to kind of help this along. You received your MD from Case Western, and you've got a master's degree in public health from the Harvard School of Public Health. Is that right?
That's correct.
All right. And your pre-filed written testimony obviously can be read. It says what it says. What I would like to ask you about is other literature that you've come across. Are you familiar with a study, so-called the Shell Global Solutions International BV study relative to toxicity findings? Are you aware of that?
I am, yes.
And what I want to get to, and I hope it doesn't take too long, is just your critique of that study, because I don't know if Summit has cited that in their secret documents they provided to the PSC that we can't see. And so I want you to tell the PSC why they shouldn't rely on that study if that's something that's been cited by Summit in these documents we don't have or otherwise provided. So can you just do a summary of why that study should not be considered and the failings of it in your opinion?
Well, I'd be happy to give a summary of it, and I would describe what I'm going to say as the limits of this study. It is a study of carbon dioxide exposures in a group of healthy males aged 18 to 25. And they exposed these healthy males to varying concentrations of carbon dioxide, including 6%, 7.5%, and 9% carbon dioxide for a period of 1 hour. And they did a variety of tests on them while they were doing it. Measured their blood pressure, measured the pH, the acid-base concentration in their blood, their respiratory rate, and so on. The purpose of this study was to observe whether or not this group of young, healthy males could tolerate those concentrations of carbon dioxide. And following the exposure period, they then administered a test called the P deletion test, which they used to draw inferences about the neurological impact of exposure to those concentrations of carbon dioxide. And they did this so-called P deletion test at 10 minutes, 30 minutes, and 60 minutes after the exposure stopped. They concluded that these volunteers tolerated exposure to 6% and 7.5% CO2 quite well, but they did not tolerate exposure to 9% at all well. Now, I started this by saying that I wanted to talk about the limitations of this. First of all, this is a population of young, healthy males, and we should not extrapolate the results of this to a more general population. In fact, the authors in that paper themselves say that the tolerance to carbon dioxide is certainly also dependent on the age and physical conditions of the individual, as well as the underlying cardiac or pulmonary disease. They observed that other studies have shown a large variability in tolerance based on those factors, such as age. And in fact, other studies show that older people are much less tolerant of carbon dioxide than young, healthy people, and people with underlying health conditions are more susceptible to carbon dioxide. The final thing I'll say about this study is this P deletion test that they used to measure and observe the neurological effects of these exposures is a test that was devised in order to determine when a person who has undergone some surgical procedure as an outpatient that requires general anesthesia. The P deletion test is used to determine when that person is awake enough to be discharged from the clinical facility in the company of somebody else who will drive him or her home. It is not a test that is adequate for determining the capacity to do complex decision-making. Moreover, when they applied this P deletion test in this particular study that we're talking about here, they only did half of it. The investigators used this test, which requires the subject to identify the letter P in a row of letters that contains not only letters P, but also B, D, and Q. They gave the study subjects 3 minutes to see how many rows they could read across to identify the P's and cross them out. That's what they did. But the P deletion test also includes an evaluation of how accurate they were during taking the test. So this study actually tells us something about the speed with which people could read these letters, but nothing about the accuracy. And the reason why this is important is because if we're trying to make come to some conclusion about safety levels of CO2 exposure during the time of a accidental release of CO2, we must understand that since CO2 is heavier than air and is colorless and odorless, that people who find themselves in a plume of CO2 that's released from a ruptured pipeline or a leaking pipeline will not know that they're in a plume of CO2 until they develop symptoms that are disturbing. And at that point, they're going to need to make some complex decisions. They're going to have to decide what's going on, what am I going to do about it, and how am I going to do it? And that's far more taxing on cognitive function than identifying P's in a row of letters on a piece of paper. So I think we should be very careful about drawing conclusions from this study as to whether or not there's going to be sufficient neurological impairment from a CO2 release that will get in the way of a person being able to self-rescue and get out into safety. So I'll stop there.
And I appreciate that summary. I want to touch on one or two other things. So you mentioned that this particular study, this Van der Scheer experimental study, which is referenced in the Shell Global Solutions International BV study, was limited to healthy males 18 to 25 who were further, an exclusion criteria was further that anyone with panic disorder, hypertension, a history of present or history of illicit drug use or present or history of alcohol, along with all sorts of other things, those people were left out. So it only left the most healthy of the healthiest males 18 to 25. Is that your understanding?
That's correct.
And in fact, it also had an exclusion related to cigarettes. And is it true that smoking, cigarette smoking can ironically potentially result in CO2 tolerance in some cases?
That's been described in some papers in the literature, and it's not too surprising since people who smoke cigarettes are regularly exposed to elevated levels of CO2, so they will have developed some tolerance. This particular group of healthy males, 18 to 25, the restriction was they couldn't smoke more than 10 cigarettes a day. But we don't know whether they smoked none or whether they smoked 8 or something in between. We just simply don't know.
So along with being somewhat critical here, or at least elevating our suspicions to the methodology and criteria of this particular study, do you also disagree about its application to any type of real world emergent situation a person might find themselves in?
Well, I think that that's the important point, that whenever you look at a study of any kind, you look at the study population and how the study was conducted, and then you ask yourself, how generalizable is this to the general population or to some segment of the general population? And that's when you go from sort of the research world into public health. And I think that the findings in this study are of interest. I've pointed out how I think that they misused the P deletion test to draw inferences about neurological impacts. But in the case of CO2 pipelines, we're talking about a very diverse population of men, women of all ages, and of all health conditions, with many different health conditions. So we can't generalize from this study as to whether or not what the tolerable levels of CO2 are in the general population. That's for certain to be true.
And lastly, Doctor, this study we've been discussing was an industry sponsored, meaning oil company sponsored and co-authored study, correct?
That's correct.
All right, Doctor. I don't have any further questions. Again, I think your literature and documents speak for themselves. So I'm going to turn you over for cross-examination.
Mr. Dublinsky, any questions?
Your Honor, as a preliminary matter, we've spent 15, 20 minutes talking about a study that is nowhere in evidence. I think it would be proper to have that study introduced as a late filed exhibit. If Mr. Jordy's willing, that's great. Otherwise, we would ask that we be allowed to do so because it just doesn't make a lot of sense to have spent 20 minutes talking about it if it's nowhere to be seen.
Mr. Jordy, can you late file an exhibit with the study?
No, and I object to that on the basis that this presentation and this evidence is due to the fact we do not know what Summit has provided the PSC. The critique of this study is such that it is not relevant at all to these proceedings, but to the extent that the PSC is potentially relying on this industry-related information through other Summit documents that only the PSC knows about, that was the limited purpose of this testimony. So as the doctor went through the study, it has no application to the North Dakota situation, which is why we wanted to make a critique of it. So no, I would not offer this. I would not provide the study because it's not applicable, which was the point of this testimony.
Your Honor, I don't mean to sound cynical, but it's certainly a coincidence, notwithstanding Mr. Jordy's purported rationale, that in Iowa, when Dr. Shetler submitted testimony, Summit had 3 weeks to file written rebuttal testimony, and that study was a non-trivial part of Dr. Lumpkin's rebuttal testimony. It certainly seems like sort of pre-rebutting rebuttal that they don't know whether it's going to actually be made or not. I question the appropriateness of that, but in any event, again, I don't want to raise my objection yet again, because I know you've ruled on it twice already today, but it's clear that what happened here is a lot of material that was submitted in Iowa, Mr. Jordy just happened to have handy, and it was a pretty easy thing to try and bulk up his case by dumping a bunch of Iowa stuff in here. And that case was key to the Iowa rebuttal. There's no reason that the commission should have to listen to 20 minutes of testimony with no context for what it's about.
Well, so Summit can put on a rebuttal case. I don't have to make their case for them, and we're in North Dakota. We're not in Iowa, and this is proper evidence.
Well, I'm not familiar with everything that came in during the Iowa proceedings, so I will take both your words for what happened there. We've already had testimony about the studies, so I think it's appropriate to bring the study into the record. So Mr. Dublinsky, if you want to file it, I will accept into the record as a Summit exhibit the study itself, and I will note landowner objection to it.
Yep, hearsay, foundation, and relevance.
Well, Mr. Jordy, you opened this door, so I'm going to allow it in.
No, the PSC's ruling not letting us see the Summit information opened all of this door and has created all of this problem.
Mr. Dublinsky?
Thank you, Your Honor. We will get that filed, and we have no questions for this witness.
All right. Mr. Pelham, any questions?
No.
Mr. Jordy, Mr. Bakke, any questions?
No questions.
Commissioner Chrisman, any questions?
None, Your Honor.
Commissioner Haugen-Hoffert?
No questions. Thank you for your testimony.
Mr. Dawson, any questions?
No questions, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Shetler, for your testimony today. And that's all the questions we have for you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Words I did not think I was going to say. We are ahead of schedule today. So are there any other matters we need to address before we adjourn?
Your Honor, just a question. I noticed that we had Mr. Steinbron and Ms. Barr on the list for today. Have those been moved, or are those no longer witnesses that are being called?
So Mr. Steinbron was my witness, and that's the one where I said there were some scheduling issues. I haven't decided for sure whether I'll call him tomorrow. One witness I did intend to call tomorrow, and I'm going to speak with her this evening, sustained an injury and is in a lot of pain and was on her way either to the hospital or the doctor, I believe. So she may be on painkillers. I can't tell you anything more. That's Bailey Elkins. So whether she's going to be able to testify or not looks like in peril, so I don't know what we do about that, but that's obviously beyond our control. And then I have Chad Wachter tomorrow as our first witness in the morning. But I'll know more about both of those other witnesses tomorrow, but we should be fine time-wise. I can't speak for Mr. Jordy.
I would concur. I suspect we'll be finishing well before 5 tomorrow. Tentatively, I'm moving Ms. Barr tomorrow, but like Mr. Bakke, based on how today went, I might be calling witnesses. But for now, I'm moving Ms. Barr, who would be very short testifier, to tomorrow.
All right. Any other matters to address before we conclude for the day? Mr. Pelham, did you have anything?
I don't, thank you.
Mr. Bakke?
The only other thing is another housekeeping detail. I did ask Mr. Powell about the Wellspun lawsuit, and BC 110 is a copy of that complaint that I was asking about, and I would offer BC 110.
Let me get to it. Any objection from Summit to BC 110?
Relevance, but if that's noted, we have no objection to it coming in.
Mr. Pelham?
Question the relevance, but I don't have any objection.
All right, I will note objection. I as well question relevance, but I will leave that to the commission to determine, and I will admit BC 110. Anything else, Mr. Bakke?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. Jordy?
No, thank you very
Any
much.
other matters? All right. Well, then we will stand in recess till 8:30 tomorrow morning.